Mysterious gaps in history we still can't explain. The fall of Great Zimbabwe. At this point, it seems like we've talked about almost every ancient civilization on this channel. However, one I've never discussed and one you've likely never heard of is an ancient kingdom known as Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe is located in modern-day Zimbabwe. It was settled around 1000 AD. Although, with the city being initially established around that time, it wouldn't be until the 11th century where major construction would take place in Great Zimbabwe. From the 11th century to the 16th century, the city of Great Zimbabwe was able to create the largest stone structures ever created in pre-colonial southern Africa. Not only were these stone structures massive in size, but they were also impressive, most notably containing zero mortar, meaning that these bricks had to be cut and placed perfectly. And when you see the true scale of some of the ruins, it only makes you wonder how exactly they even did it. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. A majority of Great Zimbabwe is contained in an area only 7 square kilometers large, although it's estimated that at its peak, Great Zimbabwe could have been home to over 10, if not 20,000 people, all at one time. The 4 primary stone structures that exist within Great Zimbabwe were the Hill Complex, the Valley Complex, the Great Enclosure, and a general contained area for common folk within the city walls. Now, even though all of these structures were built at different times and served different purposes, they were all built using the same methods and to the same quality, containing, as I mentioned earlier, precision cut brick and absolutely no mortar. The Great Enclosure, for example, has walls as high as 36 feet, and it's suspected that the Great Enclosure was actually used as a home for the royals. However, that's just speculation. On top of having impressive stone structures, the inhabitants of Great Zimbabwe, known as the Shona people, had a complex culture, social hierarchy, and even a deep understanding of metallurgy and agriculture. Based off everything we've discovered so far, Great Zimbabwe seems like any other advanced civilization, especially for the time. Which naturally begs the question, why is this not discussed more? We often discuss Egypt, China, Europe. Why isn't sub-Saharan Africa often brought up in this conversation? And the answer to that is honestly complex, and also directly coincides with the reason that we don't know exactly what happened to Great Zimbabwe. And for that reason, I'm gonna try to answer both questions at the same time. Following the development of the massive society and stone structures in Great Zimbabwe from the 11th to 15th century, we see the interesting and unfortunate downfall of Great Zimbabwe only a few hundred years later, from the 16th to 17th century. And honestly, we don't know exactly when Great Zimbabwe even fell. Why? Well, it's actually the same reason why we don't discuss Great Zimbabwe in the same breath as other early ancient civilizations. Great Zimbabwe differed from many other advanced civilizations in the way that it did not keep written records. Instead, the society relied on oral traditions, meaning they had no indigenous writing systems, but instead kept records, shared information, and passed down knowledge in the form of stories, legends, poetry, and even songs. Which is a pretty interesting concept if you think about it. Like, just imagine, instead of going to the library to learn about something, you had to go to the city storyteller to sing you a song about whatever you were looking to learn about. Regardless, this oral tradition, while interesting, did leave information in a very vulnerable position, because without having anybody to tell the story really doesn't exist. And that's exactly the position Great Zimbabwe found itself in during the 16th and 17th century. But the fact that Great Zimbabwe's records were kept via oral tradition and not written word isn't the only reason why it's not heavily discussed today. And it also doesn't mean that it wasn't an advanced civilization. Artifacts found in Great Zimbabwe, as well as stories that have survived from the existence of Great Zimbabwe, paint a picture of a complex society that not only had flourishing internal trade, but also access to large trade routes, connecting Great Zimbabwe to other civilizations multiple continents away, with a few notable examples being glass beads from India found in Great Zimbabwe, as well as Chinese porcelain ceramics from the Ming Dynasty, once again found in the ruins of Great Zimbabwe. And interestingly, it was artifacts like these that helped paint a picture about when and where this trade was taking place, and who exactly the people of Great Zimbabwe were trading with. However, it definitely doesn't fill all the gaps. With, of course, the biggest question mark being, what caused such an advanced and thriving sub-Saharan African society to seemingly just disappear? And interestingly, this disappearance was likely not overnight, and was more probably a long, drawn-out downfall. From surrounding civilizations in the time period, there was no large-scale war, natural disaster, or major event that could have possibly taken out all of Great Zimbabwe or easily answered the question of what happened to the civilization. Therefore, it's suspected that the decline happened for other reasons and not immediate. But once again, that is still suspected, primarily because we have no written record, and secondly, because when people rediscovered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, every oral tradition that explorers and colonists were given was rejected by them, simply because of their own biases. Which brings us to the second reason why Great Zimbabwe is not only not talked about today, and also is not fully understood. Not only did Great Zimbabwe not keep written records, after it was abandoned from the 15th to 16th century, it was rediscovered by European colonists. However, these colonists did not believe their eyes. Literally, when these Europeans first laid their eyes on the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, their initial thoughts and belief was that these structures were in no way possibly built by Africans, and that the only explanation for these ruins was that another civilization simply came and settled here and then decided to leave. And even though that theory had basically no validity to it, that was the recognized truth for some time. However, after decades and centuries of colonial control of the continent, and with advancements of archaeology, it came to a point where it was undeniable that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans. However, by the time that colonial scholars came to this conclusion, and the reality of the situation was accepted, many oral traditions were already lost. And while these scholars and historians at the time had the opportunity to observe and record oral tradition, they simply rejected all of them, claiming them to be nothing more than urban legends and lies. And unfortunately, the reason for all of the denial of this African advancement and history was simply because of the biased perspectives of the colonists that first rediscovered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe. Now, for a bit of comic relief, this is my interpretation of how a conversation would have went between a colonist that just rediscovered Great Zimbabwe and one of the few remaining locals. Wow, I've never seen any structure like this in sub-Saharan Africa. Thanks, yeah, my ancestors built this. This structure must have been built by the Phoenicians. No. Or maybe the Arabs. No. Or maybe the Egyptians. Nope, my grandparents. Something drastic must have forced them out of this kingdom, because who would abandon such beauty? Well, there was a salt shortage, but do you gentlemen hear wind? Because I'm not hearing anything. No, I'm trying to tell you what happened here, because you don't know. The Portuguese already confirmed these people did not have a written word. Well, that's true, but we had an oral tradition, right? And we all know that oral traditions are not reliable whatsoever. No, I could tell you hundreds of years of history. I guess our best course of action is to make up our own history. Definitely not seek any truth from local individuals who may know. I could tell you. Feels good to be a colonist. Fuck this guy. Today, fortunately, much of this institutional bias has been dismantled, and archaeology in recent years has been actively trying to restore a clearer, more accurate representation on what exactly was going on within Great Zimbabwe. Although, with much of this oral tradition no longer existing, and no written records existing at all, the fragments of information that we do have only paint a loose picture. And while theories exist about the daily life within Great Zimbabwe and its eventual decline, we may never know the history of Great Zimbabwe to the extent we know of other civilizations. And we also may never know what eventually led to its entire demise. But just because I wanted to end the section with a bit of bittersweet irony, even though European colonists believed it was completely impossible for these Africans to have built such complex archaeological stone structures, the reality of technological development actually paints a much different story. And one unique example of that is that Africa, for the most part, entered the Iron Age multiple centuries before Europe did. And the fact that Africans were smelting, forging, and creating tools out of iron far before the Europeans is, at least in my opinion, notable, and in the context of the story, ironic. But we're just getting started. The Indus Valley Civilization. When you are discussing some of the earliest urban sophisticated developments, it's hard not to mention ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia. However, one extremely notable and fitting civilization that no one seemingly ever brings up during that discussion is the Indus Valley Civilization, for a rather interesting reason. The Indus Valley Civilization, aka the Harappan Civilization, is one of the world's oldest known urban societies. It flourished in what is modern-day Northwest India and Pakistan over 7,000 years ago, and at its peak covered an area as wide as 900 miles across the Indus River, and likely had a population as high as 5 million people. Two of the most notable developments in the Indus Valley Civilization were the twin cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. And modern-day excavations of these two cities prove that the urban planning, as well as some of the architectural installments, which we'll discuss, far exceeded any of the other technological developments, at least when it comes to urban planning, in any of the surrounding or even global civilizations at the time. Some of the most impressive infrastructure that was utilized within the Indus Valley Civilization were the fact that cities were laid out in grid patterns and used a standardized baked brick system, meaning that all bricks were not only the same size, but also the same quality. the Indus Valley Civilization also had some of the world's most advanced drainage systems for the time. Not only did the two twin cities have public bathhouses with clean running water, each house in these cities also had their own clean running water and sewage systems, something that was more or less unheard of at the time. But we're still not done. On top of every individual house having some sort of sewage and well system, there was also ventilation built directly into houses and wind catchers to essentially act as early cooling systems. Keep in mind, these things date nearly as far back as 7000 BC. However, these individuals weren't just good at building. They also had a strong economy and established trade, with physical evidence proving that they had agriculture, animal domestication, metallurgy, as well as trade networks that spanned all the way from Mesopotamia to Egypt and possibly even farther. And this is kind of where we start to lose known fact. You see, from 7000 BC to 5500 BC, the Indus Valley Civilization was in what is known as the pre-Harappan time. This era was the baby steps of the development of the civilization, included early farming and early settlements. Following that roughly 1500-year span, we have the early Harappan time, which spanned from roughly 5500 BC to 2800 BC. And this is where we see the growth and establishment of commerce and trade. Following that, we have what is known as the mature Harappan era, from roughly 2800 BC to 1900 BC. And it's in this era of history where it is believed that the Indus Valley Civilization was at its peak. And this is assumed based off of physical archaeological evidence and historical context from other civilizations. And the reason I'm saying that, I'll get into in just a moment. Following what is believed to be the urban peak of the civilization, we have the late Harappan era, from 1900 BC to 1500 BC. And it's during this 400-year era that we once again see a slow decline of this massive civilization. Once again, for reasons that we cannot fully explain and that we do not understand in the slightest. Now, if this story sounds familiar, it's because it is. In the first section of this video, we discussed a very similar situation, although that civilization is mysterious because it lacked a written word. In the case of the Indus Valley Civilization, there was a written word. However, the written word used in the Indus Valley Civilization, known as the Indus script, is a script that today boggles the mind of linguists and has not in any way, shape, or form been decoded. Meaning that while we do have some written records directly from the Indus Valley Civilization himself, because we have absolutely no context on what it says and little chance of being able to decode exactly what it's saying, we may never know the true detailed history of the Indus Valley Civilization that spreads over thousands of years. The Indus script itself consists of roughly 400 to 700 distinct symbols. These symbols often appear on seals, tablets, and even pottery and other small objects. However, one unique attribute of the Indus script is that these inscriptions are usually very short, with most examples of the Indus script only having 5 symbols in a row. And while at face value that may seem like a small detail, it's actually one of the biggest reasons that this entire language has not been decoded yet. Most of the inscriptions are too short for statistical analysis of grammar, syntax, or even full sentences, which makes it hard to even confirm if these records are of a full spoken language or simply being some sort of visualization. And what I mean by this is that some scholars debate that Indus script might not even be writing at all and are simply non-linguistic symbols. However, that theory is somewhat bolstered by the fact that there is no known language that the Harappans may have spoken. And there's also no inscription pairing of Indus script to another known language, truly making Indus script a completely isolated language, if it even is one. And it's with all this mystery that leads us to the lost history. Because we are unable to read all of the available texts we don't have any insight into what daily life would have looked like, who the rulers of the Indus Valley Civilization were, what laws they had, what religion they followed, any historical events that may have taken place during their existence, and everything we know about them has basically come from archaeological finds. And it's once again due to our fragmented knowledge of the civilization that we truly have hundreds and in some cases thousands of years of history that simply does not exist. At least not in a way that we can understand it yet. This entire situation more or less displays that you could do the most important thing for seemingly the longest amount of time. However, if you don't have a reliable way of relaying that information, eventually even the most significant things could cease to exist, simply because people can't recall or retell a situation they don't understand. And in the case of the Indus Valley Civilization, there are hints and fragments to give clues about the significance of these peoples. However, until their language is deciphered and understood fully, the secrets of the civilization may remain secrets forever. The Bronze Age collapse. If you've watched any of my many in every time period videos, then you would have undoubtedly heard me mention the fact that the time period between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age was a rather tumultuous time. And while in some of those videos I've gone into vague detail about why that is, in this section I can really dive deep, at least deeper than normal. Now, it's important to note that the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age takes place at different times depending on what society and culture you're talking about. And for the context of this section, I'm going to be focused mainly in the Eastern Mediterranean, as that's where we see one of the most significant gaps of history as we transition out of the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age. And it's also why this time period, at least in this area, is known as the Bronze Age collapse. Prior to the collapse, during the late Bronze Age, roughly from 1500 to 1200 BC, we see one of the world's most impressive interconnected chains of sophisticated civilizations. And what that looks like in the Eastern Mediterranean is major powers such as the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Greece, and Mesopotamian city-states. All of these civilizations were considered to be highly advanced and shared similar characteristics such as palace economies, unsurprisingly advanced bronze metallurgy, massive monumental buildings, and possibly most notably, literacy and complex administrative systems such as record-keeping, taxation, resource distribution, governance, and even project management. To put it bluntly, these societies were just locked in. And on top of that, they were also pretty in line with each other in the form of trade and sharing culture and technological advancements. However, the setup that these civilizations had was far from perfect. All of these societies were known as palace societies, which in a nutshell meant that the royal palace served as the heart of the society, meaning that the society's ruler, typically a king, would have centralized power over all administrative, economic, and religious control, and would in turn control production, trade, and wealth distribution. It was essentially an early form of communism. The government would collect raw materials, goods, taxes, and then do its best to try to redistribute these resources evenly. At least evenly amongst common folk, as a vast majority would stay within the bureaucracy of the government. But that's a different point. While to some individuals, the concept of a palace society and a centralized power redistributing wealth may sound like a good idea, it ultimately proved to be rather fragile. And that's because any disruption of the supply chain to the palace, or the ruler of the society, would eventually lead to the entire civilization going without whatever was disrupted in the supply chain. And a simple example of how this could look is if a wheat crop was simply not as bountiful as anticipated one year, the palace would have less wheat to distribute, meaning they were posed with a tough decision. Do they simply give everybody less, or do they give some people none? That alone is tough, but survivable. But in other instances where a vital resource is simply not readily available for the palace, everybody in the society suffers. Once again because the civilians of the society relied on the palace, and the palace relied on their supply chain to keep their civilization alive. And as we've now demonstrated, interruptions could be life or death. And the reason I'm giving so much context into this concept specifically is because it's exactly due to these supply chain interruptions that caused the entire collapse of the Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean, at least partly. As I mentioned, for a period of time during the late Bronze Age, this early version of globalization was able to provide so much prosperity until it couldn't. Unlike the other gaps in history we've discussed so far, the Bronze Age collapse was not a slow, painful decline. It was rather immediate, at least in the context of history. Over the course of only roughly a few decades, we saw some of the most prosperous, thriving societies turn into essentially rubble, for reasons we still don't fully understand to this day. The exact explanation for the Bronze Age collapse is not a simple or straightforward one at all. And the best understanding we have so far was that this collapse was more or less of a perfect storm of multiple systems failing at the same time. For starters, it's believed that there was significant climate and environmental stress happening in multiple areas where these civilizations depended on for food. One prominent theory is that prolonged droughts caused crop failures, which then caused famines, which then caused civil unrest, which then caused invasions, which then caused total societal collapse. Because if you have people that are starving, mad, and at war with themselves and their neighboring city-states, you really no longer have a civilization. And that theory, in the context of the Bronze Age collapse, really makes sense. Especially when you consider that while these city-states had really good trade connections and really good communication, they were too intertwined with each other. Essentially meaning that while the House of Cards looked really big and impressive, all it would take is for one card at the bottom to fail for then the entire House of Cards to collapse. And that's exactly what we saw. If every society relied on each other for trade and strategic direction, all it would take is one of these societies to have a poor crop yield or civil unrest to allow that societal unrest to spread, negatively impacting other city-states that weren't even involved initially. Regardless, while we do have theories about the possible aspects that led to the Bronze Age collapse, we still don't know the exact order in which they came. Did foreign invasions happen because of a prolonged drought? Did a pre-existing famine weaken these societies, making them seem like a prime target for invaders? Did the complex economic system implode on itself as soon as a possible famine hit? Really, we don't know. Which leads to the biggest mystery and the biggest gap in history when it comes to the Bronze Age collapse. As most of these Eastern Mediterranean civilizations began to more or less collapse in unison, we also saw a massive collapse in literacy. And with that, the total abandonment of multiple different types of writing systems from different civilizations, literally causing significant gaps of not only historical knowledge of the time, but also historical knowledge of the city-states and civilizations prior to the Bronze Age collapse. You need to keep in mind, during this time, people were dying, buildings were burning, and records were being destroyed. And if oral traditions are not a part of your society, and many civilizations of your society are not living regardless, there's a good chance a lot, if not all, of the records and knowledge of your history will not make it far into the future. And while we still have plenty of information to this day about Greece, about the Hittite Empire, about the New Kingdom of Egypt, it's believed that there is much more information that we simply do not know and will never know. And one of the biggest specific gaps of information loss was roughly 1200 BC to 1150 BC. And it's during that 50-year span that we saw some of the most violent deconstruction, as well as abandonments of some of the most robust and established Eastern Mediterranean civilizations. However, as traumatic and unfortunate as the Bronze Age collapse was, it wasn't all bad for everyone. Because even though some societies were essentially wiped out during this transition period, there were other civilizations that were injured but survived, and others who benefited greatly, with a couple civilizations being the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Assyrian Empire, and the Phoenician city-states. Many of the records we have in regards to the Bronze Age collapse actually come from the New Kingdom of Egypt. And that's because while they were affected by the same afflictions that essentially wiped out most of the Eastern Mediterranean civilizations, they weren't taken out entirely, and they were able to continue to keep records and tell the story, with one of the most notable documents that they created during this time being the invasion of sea peoples that allegedly thoroughly disrupted regular life across all of the Mediterranean, including Egypt themselves. Regardless, as history has always proven, people are resilient. And following the Bronze Age collapse, people and societies did learn from their mistakes, and they began to rebuild. And it was this exact same collapse of society that opened up the door to opportunity for a brand new society. A society that was based on a better metal. Societies that were smaller and more self-sufficient, and societies that were more decentralized. But yeah, there's no doubt that the Iron Age was not perfect. And there's also no doubt that the Bronze Age destruction was not an extremely tragic time in history, where we saw the loss of written word, literacy, culture, unimaginable amounts of history, and so much more. But regardless, out of all of this, we did see one of the most blatant examples of humanity taking a massive setback and turning it into an opportunity to spring far forward in terms of technological and societal advancements. The forgotten first settlers. If I told you to describe a time in history where people got on boats, left their native land, and went on to develop societies and cultures all across the ocean, who would you assume I'm talking about? You'd likely assume I was talking about the European expansion, in which Britain, Spain, and Portugal and other countries essentially left Europe to conquer new lands. And while that may be a good guess, that's not who I'm referring to at all. And I would actually be describing the Pacific Polynesian voyagers, a group of Polynesian seafarers that from roughly 1300 BC to 1250 AD dominated a massive triangle of the Pacific Ocean, and in that time populated almost every remote island that exists in that area. In most cases, the Polynesians beat the Europeans to most of their global destinations by hundreds of years, which is an interesting flex, but is also potentially an unfortunate fact for reasons we'll get into. Before we get into anything else, I think it's important to note exactly how impressive the Polynesian navigation was. Not only were they taking multiple 1,000-kilometer-long voyages across the open Pacific Ocean, but they were also doing so in essentially canoe-like boats. On top of making rather simple boats and using them to navigate the open ocean, they also navigated that ocean expertly using no maps, no compass, or any form of written navigation. It's believed that these Polynesian voyagers used the stars, ocean swells, and even bird flight patterns to navigate amongst the open waters, which is an assumption that makes sense considering there's not really any other explanation on how they could have possibly done what they did. Similar to the first civilization we discussed in this video, these Polynesian tribes mainly relied on their large body of knowledge from their oral tradition, and unfortunately did not keep many written records, which was probably partly due to their existence. On the boats they used to travel, there was barely enough room for people and food, let alone written records, therefore making oral tradition more of a necessity than an option. It's believed that these Polynesian voyagers would split up into groups, and high-ranking members of society would establish a guild on new islands they would settle. This guild of individuals living on these new islands were typically experts in navigation, and this was a survival mechanism, because if there was ever a famine or lack of resources that would enable life on these islands, the guild member on this island would need to be able to navigate either back home or to another island where they could redevelop their settlement. And interestingly, all of the information that these guilds held was typically taught and stored in the form of song. Meaning that if you're a Polynesian tribe on a remote island and you've run out of coconuts, your best way of going to safety is to ask your friend, hey, what's the song to get to the next island? And soon enough, you'll begin singing and sailing and making your way to an island your ancestors already discovered and likely left you some secrets on. But speaking of secrets, many of the wayfinding techniques and canoeing construction methods that allowed Polynesian voyagers to create such a vast triangle of area where they more or less controlled the Pacific Ocean were kept as guild secrets, meaning they were not meant to leave the Polynesian people. And even still to this very day, many of those secrets remain. However, there has been a modern revival of these skills, and with it, modern records being created of these ancient methods. Some of the most notable achievements of the Polynesian voyagers is the landing of Polynesians in Easter Island and, of course, the creation of the mysterious structures, although they did land on that island far before the Europeans ever did. And most notably, one of the most mysterious occurrences is the fact that sweet potatoes with ethnic origins to South America were found all across Polynesia far before European contact ever happened. Meaning that while there is no recorded record of it, genetic evidence suggests that in some way, shape, or form, Polynesians contacted South America, or at least South Americans, and acquired sweet potatoes, and then cultivated them in Polynesia. Which is an interesting story, but an even more interesting mystery, considering to this day we have no idea how it happened. And much like the rest of the Polynesian maritime success, the true extent of its history remains a mystery, simply because written records were sparse and oral traditions were lost to time. And while it's no doubt that there are plenty of talented seafarers from Europe, and the way the world looks today is kind of an example of that, the Polynesians were voyaging the seas far before the Europeans with far less. But that's a subject for another video. Crazy conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. The July 20th plot. If I told you that during World War II, Adolf Hitler accidentally signed an executive order that would not only incentivize the assassination of Hitler himself, but also allow military coups to overthrow the entire Nazi regime, would you believe me? Honestly, probably not, and I wouldn't blame you. Hitler himself didn't believe it either. However, this theorized and actualized conspiracy was very much so real, and the entire story is insane. Let me explain. In 1943, near the end of World War II, the German government realized that civil unrest was becoming a larger and larger risk. The Nazis could no longer hide that they were losing the war, and resistance groups in Germany were gaining power as it was becoming more and more obvious that the Nazi Party was doing unimaginable atrocities. Operation Valkyrie was an executive order that was signed and authorized in late 1943 by Adolf Hitler. And the entire purpose of Operation Valkyrie was to help the German government maintain control in the event of any unexpected, chaotic event, such as a domestic uprising, and of course, the death of Adolf Hitler. If any of these types of events were to take place, Operation Valkyrie would essentially allow Germany's reserve army to take control of the country and, by any means necessary, subdue the civilian unrest. In the eyes of Hitler, this plan made perfect sense. If any domestic issues began to take place on German soil, this operation would give the German reserve army the autonomy and power to resolve that issue. And while at a glance it may seem logical, this plan had one fatal flaw. The amount of power this operation was able to give in an emergency situation was very easily manipulated, especially after the original operation plan was edited by a few high-ranking Nazi officials that were actually working for the resistance. One of the most notable Nazi officers involved in this plan to assassinate Hitler was a man named Klaus von Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg was a Nazi army officer who participated in the invasion of Poland, France, and North Africa. Prior to the Second World War and during the beginning of World War II, Stauffenberg believed deeply in Hitler's leadership in the Nazi movement. However, over the course of the Second World War, he began to question his loyalty to Hitler and also question whether or not the Second World War was even necessary in the first place. As his doubts in the Nazi Party grew, his connection to the resistance secretly grew as well, as Stauffenberg's immediate family and higher-ups were also secretly part of the Nazi resistance movement, essentially a group of Germans who staunchly opposed the Nazi movement. By September 1943, Stauffenberg had more or less recovered from losing an eye, a hand, and multiple fingers in Tanzania only a few months prior. And at this point, he was also fully committed to the resistance movement and no longer mentally aligned with the Nazi Party. Because of Stauffenberg's injuries, he could no longer fight in battle, and was instead positioned as the staff officer of the Reserve Army of Germany, a high-ranking position that would give Stauffenberg direct access to the Reserve Army and Hitler himself. And it was coincidentally not long after Stauffenberg got this position that Operation Valkyrie was signed and authorized by Hitler, something that gave Stauffenberg and the other covert resistance members a very unique opportunity that they knew they had to act on. The conspiracy was simple. Stauffenberg and his superior, General Frederick Ulbricht, would first modify Operation Valkyrie to essentially broaden its power, making sure that the resistance army could sustain the entire country in an emergency situation. However, in the case of the July 20th plot, the emergency situation was going to be manufactured, and so were the pretenses that this reserve army were going to be operating under. With the new and improved Operation Valkyrie, the resistance would enact an emergency, in this case, killing Hitler, and blame said emergency on the SS. And these two parts of the plan were crucial. The death of Hitler was crucial because loyalty to Hitler himself was so ingrained in every aspect of daily life for military officers and government officials that if Hitler was still alive, there would be too much resistance to overthrow the government. And the reason that the SS needed to be blamed was so the Reserve Army would have a reason to take out a large portion of the people who were most loyal to Hitler himself. And of course, if you have nobody to be loyal to and nobody giving that loyalty to that person that doesn't exist, you no longer have a movement and a power vacuum is created. This would then allow the resistance to take total control of the German government, and then once power was solidified, do everything in their power to rebrand Germany and begin negotiation with the Allies to end the war as quickly as possible. And with the finalization of the plan for this conspiracy, the resistance knew that it was only a matter of time before they had to enact their plan, which brings us to the name of the July 20th plot. On July 20th, 1944, this conspiracy to kill Hitler became an official attempt to kill Hitler, and it would also be the last ever assassination attempt on Hitler. Around 12:30 p.m. on July 20th, 1944, a meeting was being conducted at Hitler's private bunker, the Wolf Lair, in East Prussia, modern-day Poland. This meeting was one of the only opportunities that Stauffenberg had to try to assassinate Hitler, which is why when he went to this meeting, he went armed. And to this meeting, he brought with him a briefcase that was full of explosives. At the beginning of the meeting, Stauffenberg sat down, placed his briefcase under the table close to Hitler, and went about the meeting as usual. A few hours into the meeting, Stauffenberg took a planned phone call and exited the room. This phone call was the perfect opportunity to not only leave the meeting, but to leave the Wolf's Lair altogether. And Stauffenberg was able to get a ride far away from a meeting room that was about to blow. Shortly after Stauffenberg left, the briefcase bomb detonated and killed 4 of the 20 people in the room. However, surprisingly, Hitler was not one of them. And I say surprisingly because look at the damage in the room. It's insane to believe that anybody survived this, let alone just Hitler. But it's believed that Hitler survived this explosion for a few reasons. For starters, one of the people in the meeting moved the briefcase with his foot because it was simply in his way. This person unintentionally moved the briefcase away from Hitler, potentially saving his life. Besides that, this meeting took place in a different meeting room. It wasn't in an underground cement bunker like originally planned. Due to the summer heat, it was actually moved to a more open wooden room. And finally, it's believed that because of the large, thick maple desk that this meeting was taking place on, a majority of the explosion happened under the desk. And it's actually been reported that this explosion literally blew Hitler's pants off. Although, as hilarious as that sounds, that was not part of the mission. However, Stauffenberg didn't know that, and neither did any member of the resistance. Which is why, shortly after it was believed that Hitler was killed, Operation Valkyrie was enacted. And for only roughly 5 hours, the Reserve Army was able to gain control of key buildings in Berlin. However, that was until the Minister of Propaganda was able to get a phone call from Hitler himself, and this entire coup attempt was blown wide open. And unfortunately, all of the resistance members that enacted Operation Valkyrie were executed that same day. And following this failed attempt, Hitler's chokehold on the civilian population and the German government only grew tighter. And in the months following this attempt, over 7,000 people were arrested in connection to this conspiracy, and almost 5,000 were executed. Now, it is important to note that not all of those individuals were actually connected to the conspiracy whatsoever, and it is believed that the Gestapo, the Nazi Party's secret police, would simply use the excuse of being connected to the assassination attempt to have individuals they didn't like either arrested or killed. However, even though the July 20th plot was a failure, not all was lost, because this event in history just goes to show the sheer amount of dedication that the resistance party in Germany had during World War II. And even though the actions of the July 20th plot didn't end the war, as well as the life of Adolf Hitler himself, would go on to end not even a year later. During World War II, there was countless attempts to take Adolf Hitler's life. However, the July 20th plot is by far the most famous and potentially the most interesting example ever recorded. Project 112. It's no secret that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the United States government had absolutely no issue dosing people with random substances just to see what would happen. One famous example of that is Project MKUltra. However, one lesser-known example of that is Project 112. Project 112 ran from 1962 to 1973, and the entire goal of Project 112 was essentially to create aerosol-based biological and chemical agents that could produce, quote, controlled temporary incapacitation, essentially making a death spray, or at least a controlled near-death spray, in a can. Now, hearing that your government is actively trying to develop an aerosol-based death spray, or at least paralysis spray, is terrifying enough. But what's more terrifying is, of course, how they went about testing the viability of such a weapon. From the limited declassified documents we currently have, it's known that at least 50 trials were conducted over the course of the entirety of Project 112. And these trials involved compounds as safe as tear gas, and also involved other compounds as deadly as the deadliest known biological agents ever synthesized. And it's believed that new biological agents actually were created throughout the entirety of Project 112 as well, although that information is still classified. Out of these many secret tests, the government deliberately exposed US soldiers on military bases to chemical weapons without their knowledge or their consent. And typically how this would look is soldiers would just be told that there's a test going on at the base, they need to wear a gas mask for a bit, and that was all. The smoke they're going to see is harmless, and it is simply a test. Although what was really happening was all of these soldiers were literally guinea pigs in testing biological warfare chemical weapons. And in many of these tests, it's even been confirmed that these aerosol sprays sprayed on these military bases also went on to infect nearby civilian populations, meaning that the government literally and essentially intentionally exposed innocent civilians to chemical weapons simply to see what would happen. Some of the most notable examples of these civilian tests include having secret agents infect a Greyhound bus terminal with a bacteria chemical weapon using spray generators that were hidden in a briefcase. And another example takes place in a New York City subway station where for 3 days, secret government agents were dropping light bulbs filled with a specific bacteria to see if the bacteria would infect people and spread. Nobody in the Greyhound terminal knew what was happening, nobody in the New York subway station was happening, and it was even later reported that the local police or transit authorities were completely unaware of what was happening at their place of work and business. And in the case of the New York City subway test specifically, later tests went on to show that creating a citywide epidemic is more than possible simply by dropping a few light bulbs in a heavily populated area, given you release the right virus or disease. Fortunately, there has been no reported deaths or illnesses with any of the civilian trials we know of. However, with how little is known, it's completely possible that people were injured, severely injured, or even killed by these covert tests. But, of course, we're still not done. On top of these experimental toxic aerosol sprays being sprayed in open air environments, the government did also focus on spraying their own battleships to make sure that their battleships were able to defend from chemical warfare. And that entire set of tests is an operation within an operation, known as Project SHAD, Shipboard Hazard and Defense, which was a subsect of Project 112. Project SHAD specifically focused on spraying US warships with deadly chemical or biological warfare agents to make sure that the cabin crew still had warfighting capability. But once again, the government went about these tests in the worst way possible. Members of the Navy on these US warships were told that tests were being conducted. However, they were told that the smoke they were seeing outside of the ship was completely harmless and was just to test leaks and other less sensitive vulnerabilities on the boats. On top of this, all of the people on the boats were given gas masks. However, if you give somebody a gas mask but also tell them the gas they're going to see isn't deadly, they're likely not going to take defending themselves as seriously. Regardless, over the course of a few years, numerous battleships were were sprayed day in and day out, and the cabin crew were unknowingly conducting tests all day, not just to see the vulnerabilities of the ship, but also to see the vulnerabilities of their own human body. Following the alleged dismantlement of this project in 1973, the government sternly denied that anything of the sort ever happened. Although people began to question what was really happening in all of these unique and seemingly unexplainable military tests, and after decades of the government denying that anything had ever happened in regards to testing chemical agents on the military or the public, in 2002, congressional hearings that took place about Project Shad confirmed that these open-air tests and covert tests did take place, and US sailors exposed to these chemicals filed a federal class action lawsuit. It's been reported that many of the veterans that were subjected to these illegal secret tests later suffered from mysterious health conditions, such as rare types of cancer, neurological disorders, and even different respiratory diseases. However, almost none of these have been attributed to Project 112 itself. And even though in 2002 the Department of Defense did admit to some of the tests taking place, many of the details surrounding the entire project are classified to this day, and allegedly, according to the government, as they looked into the projects, many of those classified documents don't even exist anymore and have likely been deleted or erased. The information we know about Project 112 and Project Shad is disturbing, although at this point, it's truly not surprising. And while there is still so much we don't know about this project, it is very unlikely that there are many things we will simply never know, and like countless other atrocities, this will simply be swept under the rug and unfortunately forgotten. Which is why I like to mention stuff like this in videos like this. Hopefully you guys are enjoying the revival of this series, and if you guys want to see more true, crazy conspiracy theories, leave a like or leave a comment below saying part 6 at this point, or just comment more. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. We make great videos every single Friday. But with that, let's continue to discover more crazy, true conspiracy theories. Project Chaos. Staying in the 1960s and 70s, we have another violation of rights and blatant disregard for the law. From 1967 to 1974, Operation Chaos was established by Lyndon B. Johnson and expanded under Richard Nixon, with the stated sole intention of uncovering possible foreign influence in America. However, the true goal and the reality of this operation is much darker than you could imagine. Now, giving US government and the CIA the benefit of the doubt, when Operation Chaos was launched, it is very likely that the original plan was to identify and remove foreign influence in the United States, as there was a very real threat of Russian spies and other sorts of espionage happening on American soil. Or at least so the government thought. But quickly after the operation began, the United States government learned that they didn't have to only use this on potential foreign threats, and actually use the methods we're about to discuss to gain information on and dismantle domestic entities, including movements and people that the United States government or CIA deemed to be subversive. But we'll get to all of that. You see, identifying Russian spies on American soil isn't easy. However, identifying people that don't agree with the American government in America isn't hard to find. And a good place to start looking is at protests, which is why, under Operation Chaos, the CIA quickly began to infiltrate different protests by placing undercover agents to collect information, and then from that, names of individuals would be collected, mail would be intercepted, phones would be tapped, and over the course of Operation Chaos, records of over 300,000 people belonging to over 1,000 different groups would be kept by the CIA simply because they were exercising their constitutional right to freedom of speech and freedom of thought. Now, if this entire operation sounds familiar, it's because it's very similar to another operation I've covered in a different video. That operation being COINTELPRO. However, COINTELPRO was a set of illegal projects conducted by the FBI, and Operation Chaos was conducted by the CIA. However, they both had similar goals and did similar things. They illegally infiltrated, monitored, and publicly discredited groups that were vocal about disagreeing with the US government. And in the case of Operation Chaos, two primary groups that the CIA was targeting were groups that opposed the Vietnam War and groups that stood up for civil rights. Near the end of the existence of Operation Chaos, the scope of the project spread so wide that anything that even remotely looked counterculture or even left-leaning was a target of investigation by Operation Chaos. And interestingly, even though the entire point allegedly of Project Chaos was to find foreign influence on American soil, it was reported by intelligence officer Richard Helm directly to the president on November 15th, 1967 that the CIA, quote, had uncovered no evidence of any contact between the most prominent peace movement leaders and foreign embassies in the US or abroad, essentially meaning that these domestic peace groups were simply that, and were not influenced or even in contact with foreign governments. But the government likely already knew that, and simply simply wanted to use that to spy on citizens that didn't agree with them. Regardless, even after learning that Operation Chaos was essentially revealing no useful information about foreign influence on American soil, it wouldn't be until 7 years later in 1973 when Operation Chaos would be formally closed, as there was a massive uproar in America due to the Watergate scandal. And only a year after the ending of Project Chaos, it would be exposed that the entire operation was conducted illegally. It was a blatant abuse of power by intelligence agencies. However, these agencies still exist to this very day and have seemingly endless power. And while Operation Chaos formally was disbanded allegedly over 50 years ago, some people still believe that this operation is still going on to this very day, either by a different name or by no name at all. And if you just think about what these intelligence agencies were doing under Project Chaos or under COINTELPRO, it's hard to imagine similar things, if not the exact same things, are not still happening to this very day. But that's still theoretical. Secret radiation experiments. During the early 1940s, the United States government had a secret project they were working on known as the Manhattan Project. If you watched the movie Oppenheimer, then you likely know what the Manhattan Project was about. And in case you're unfamiliar, the Manhattan Project is its own secret project that resulted in building the atomic bomb that ended up being dropped on Japan, essentially ending World War II. But that's a whole different story. During the Manhattan Project, scientists knew that they were working with very dangerous radioactive materials. However, they didn't know exactly how these substances affected the human body. Scientists began monitoring themselves and other individuals working at these bomb-making sites. And on top of that, they also started doing animal tests. However, they concluded that both of these efforts were not giving them enough information about how radiation was affecting the human body. Now, the reason why the scientists wanted to know exactly how these radioactive materials would affect the human body is because they wanted to know how they could better protect scientists and bomb-making workers, allegedly. But they went about it in likely the most unethical way. In early 1944, scientists officially decided that if they wanted to get proper information, they had to do human tests. And how they planned about going about that was by injecting humans with these radioactive chemicals, and of course, they would do it without their knowledge or consent. In the following year of 1945, the injections began. And from 1945 to 1947, an estimated 30 or more people were secretly injected with different radioactive materials, all across the United States at hospitals that were loosely connected to the Manhattan Project. The first ever individual injected under this covert operation was a 53-year-old African-American construction worker named Ebb Cade. Ebb was injured in a car accident and was suffering with a broken leg. He found himself at one of the hospitals associated with the Manhattan Project, and he unfortunately unknowingly became a target for radiation testing. While in the hospital, his surgery was intentionally delayed so he could be injected with plutonium every day for 5 days in a row. And after the 5th day, the surgery he desperately needed to fix his leg would happen. However, in that surgery, doctors would extract numerous teeth and bone samples for the Manhattan Project scientists to study. Just in case that didn't land, a man broke his leg, went to the hospital. They told him he couldn't have surgery for 5 days, and in those 5 days, they were injecting him with plutonium without telling him. After his surgery, he discharged himself from the hospital and died 8 years later of heart failure. This is only one of the many stories involved in this secret radiation project, and the victims that were targeted for this project were vast. Terminally ill children, pregnant women, men, basically anybody these doctors and scientists could get their hands on, they were experimenting on. However, interestingly, in some cases, the doctors didn't even know what they were injecting. They were simply instructed by a scientist to give the patient this vial and no other context was given. Meaning that not only were individuals completely violated, but some of these doctors were also unintentionally pushed to go against their oath and personal ethics. Interestingly, the only reason that the plutonium injection experiment stopped in 1947 was mainly because the war ended. And also, the Manhattan Project was ending and was instead being replaced with the Atomic Energy Commission. Fortunately, with this new commission, new rules were introduced, with the most notable being patients must be given informed consent in regards to radiation experiments. And experiments should only be done if there was a reasonable chance that it could help the patient medically. Although, unfortunately, there was still small radiation experiments that took place across the country to varying degrees. Once again, on children, pregnant women, or prisoners, in most cases to determine how much radiation the human kidney can handle, of all things. Due to the amount of flack that the Nazis were getting in regards to their human experiments that they did during World War II, the United States government decided to classify all information regarding the plutonium injection experiments. However, internally within the government, these experiments were becoming known in the 1980s. And in the early 1990s, the Albuquerque Tribune uncovered the entire series of experiments that took place, and not only talked about the horrors of these experiments, but also found the identity of the victims. In response to this entire covert operation being exposed nearly 50 years later, President Bill Clinton set up an entire advisory known as the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments to take on an extensive investigation into what exactly happened during these experiments. And with that, thousands of documents were declassified, and numerous hearings were held. And in 1995, an official report was released that detailed the full extent of the experiments, made ethical judgments on whether or not what they were doing was ethical, surprise, it wasn't, and even gave recommendations to Congress on what they should do about this information. And while at the time that this was all exposed, every single one of the subjects had died, families of all of the victims were awarded payments from the federal government because of the illegal experiments that took place on their family members. And 2 years later, laws were formally put in place to prohibit the secret scientific testing of anything on anybody. And it's kind of crazy to think that it wasn't until 1997 there was a formal ban on doing secret scientific tests on people. However, even with those still in place today, I wouldn't count on such a thing never happening. And if you watched my video about banned torture methods, then you would know that even though torture was globally banned in the 1940s, America was caught doing it a lot from the 1940s all the way into the early 2000s. But that's a different story. It's kind of crazy to think that the real reality for some people is that they were sitting on the couch one day, they got a call from a government official that more or less told them, hey, we have a check for like 40 grand for you. Oh, why? Well, it's because we injected your great-grandmother with plutonium every day for a week, and we didn't tell her about it. Where can we send the check? For people who weren't made aware of this scandal when it broke in the 1990s, that would be shocking news. And also, potentially the most odd lottery you could win. But yeah, if we've learned anything from this video so far, it's that if the US government needs information on something, they are more than okay with secretly testing it on military personnel and civilians. And on top of that, hiding it and lying about it for as long as possible. And it just makes you think, how many tests and experiments do we not know about? And how many are going on as we speak? The White Sox scandal. In the year 1919, over 100 years ago, the Chicago White Sox played the Cincinnati Reds in the 1919 World Series. At the time, the Chicago White Sox were on a hot streak, and were very much so the favored team to win the World Series. However, after the White Sox suffered a massive upset of a loss to the Cincinnati Reds, people quickly began to question what was really going on, as this was no ordinary loss. Not only were the White Sox playing amazingly well this season, all of the fumbles that resulted in their loss during this World Series game were fumbles that never should have happened, and almost seemed intentional. And not for no reason either. Chicago White Sox players had a reputation for being underpaid. And while some players were simply happy to playing the sport they loved professionally, others felt like they weren't getting what they deserved, and decided if they couldn't get their money from the owner of the team, they would get it elsewhere, which is where gambling gets involved. One of the White Sox players, Chick Gandil, met with the rich Boston bookmaker and discussed how he could potentially throw the game for a large payout. And that's exactly what happened. Gandil was able to get 7 other White Sox players on board, and as a result, 8 White Sox players caused the White Sox to lose the final game in the World Series. However, in return, each of these players received anywhere from $5,000 to $35,000, which is, in today's money, roughly $100,000 to $650,000. And while that may sound like a good payday, only a year later, as rumors began to grow of the game being fixed because of how laughable the performance was, a grand jury was assembled to investigate what exactly went on. And that same grand jury issued its decision later that year that all 8 players were hit with indictments of conspiracy to defraud the public. And interestingly, all of the other 10 players who were not implicated in the scandal were actually given $1,500 bonus checks, roughly $25,000 in today's money, just for being honest. Which is at least a nice surprise coming from an alleged cheap team owner. Regardless, after these indictments, trials took place, and even though 3 of the 8 players confessed to what they had done, all of the 8 players were acquitted, and the jury decided they were all not guilty. The details surrounding the acquittal, as well as the entire trial, are worthy of their own separate video. But the bottom line here is that all of these players that intentionally defrauded the public by throwing the World Series were served absolutely 0 legal repercussions. No fines, no fees, no jail time, nothing. Not even a slap on the wrist. They all walked free. However, they did all receive a lifetime ban from the MLB, which some may argue is a worthy enough punishment in its own. Regardless, the fact that nobody had any legal repercussions is questionable to say the least. And it just makes you wonder, was the jury paid off to throw, well, the trial? Once again, that's speculation, and for the sake of this video, I'll just stick to the facts. But for this last section, I did want to give this video a bit of a palate cleanse because I know this video got dark and morbid. And while the situation is definitely dark in its own regard, it's definitely not injecting old people with plutonium just to see what would happen dark. Every reason you can't go to Antarctica. Antarctica is undoubtedly the most cold, isolated, and mysterious continent on the entire planet. From rather limited historical accounts to a plethora of modern-day conspiracy theories, there is a seemingly endless amount of questions surrounding Antarctica as a continent, as well as its rather unique travel regulations. And unfortunately, many of these questions either don't have answers or have an answer that the general public does not find very satisfying. Which is why, in this video, I'm going to start by giving a brief history of Antarctica as a continent, and then explore some of the conspiracy theories that people have as to why over 58 different countries have signed the Antarctic Treaty that, among other things, limits travel to almost everybody except the wealthy and elite scientists. And then we'll take a deeper dive into what the official explanation is as to why there are so many rules and regulations in the 5th biggest continent in the entire world. If you love history, mystery, and conspiracies, this video is for you. Let's get started. The frozen continent. Antarctica is not only the coldest place on Earth, but it's also the driest and windiest. It exists in the southernmost point in the entire world, and 98% of its landmass is covered with an ice sheet almost 5 kilometers thick in some places. And it's actually in that thick ice where we find 70% of the world's fresh water. However, it still, kind of ironically, is considered a desert, which, while interesting, makes sense considering the minuscule amount of precipitation the continent sees on an annual basis. But basic fun facts aside, I want to dive into the history of Antarctica, because even that element of this continent's lore is rather mysterious and elusive in its own regard. While some of the earliest recorded sightings and landings of Antarctica date all the way back to the early 1800s, the first known recorded theories and concepts of Antarctica predate the earliest sightings by thousands of years, and even predate the Common Era. The first known recorded theory of a large landmass existing at the South Pole took place in roughly 350 BC by Greek philosophers, and it was actually at this time where they coined the term Antarctica, or as it was known in Greek, Antarkitos, which roughly translates to opposite the Arctic. And the reason for this theory or hypothesis had absolutely nothing to do with observation or geographic calculation. It was simply a guess that because there were so many landmasses in the northern hemisphere, there obviously had to be more unknown continents in the southern hemisphere as well. But in case you're wondering what the logic was, to put it simply, it was balance. That's right, just balance. Why? Because the world simply wouldn't be balanced without it. And while it's a seemingly funny hypothesis, it had a lot more validity than they could ever know. It wouldn't be until hundreds of years after these initial theories that we would start to see this concept be put into practice. And how this looked was in roughly 150 AD, half Roman, half Egyptian geographer Claudius Ptolemy would begin including a vast landmass in the maps he would create. He would call this landmass Terra Australis, which roughly translated to southern land. And while at this point there was still no evidence at all of a large southern continent existing, there was at least enough speculation that such a landmass could exist to begin putting it into official maps and documents. And if you're curious what the justification was for this speculation nearly 500 years later was, well, it wasn't just balance, it was also symmetry, which is kind of still balance. But yeah, OCD didn't exist back in my day. Regardless, following the introduction of Terra Australis in maps after 150 AD, almost every map following that time would include it, although there was never any evidence to justify it. One notable example of the persistent belief in this theory is basically any map from the medieval era. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, in medieval Europe and beyond, maps either included Terra Australis, once again Latin for southern land, or an extremely similar southern landmass known as Terra Australis Incognita, translating to the unknown southern land, essentially representing the same thing, although with a bit more honesty. However, even with all of the European maps from the medieval era claiming this continent existed, it wouldn't be until hundreds of years later, once again, that it would finally be spotted. With January 27th, 1820 being the generally accepted first ever recorded sighting of the continental landmass of Antarctica. The expedition responsible for this first ever recorded sighting actually started all the way back in 1819. During the time, Tsar Alexander, the Emperor of Russia, authorized an expedition to explore the Southern Ocean. and to continue the work of James Cook, which put briefly was to search for land near the South Pole, to determine whether or not the whole Terra Australis concept had any validity. This brand new and lofty expedition was commanded by Fabian Gottlieb Benjamin von Bellingshausen, or Fabian for short. Fabian was a German naval officer, cartographer, and was already an explorer in the Imperial Russian Navy, meaning he had the connections and the credentials to be the man for the job. And with him in command and an expert team behind him and his crew set sail in July of 1819, beginning a journey that would not only change history forever, but would also leave these men at sea for over 2 years. After initially setting sail, it wouldn't be until roughly 6 months later in January of 1820 that Fabian and his crew would not only cross into the Arctic Circle for the first time ever since James Cook, and also discover something never seen before, something they described as an ice sheet of extreme height. Obviously, what they witnessed was the ice wall, the wall that surrounds our very flat Earth and keeps us all safe. I'm totally kidding, but we'll be getting to the conspiracies soon. What it's believed that they saw during this expedition was the Fimble Ice Shelf, a part of continental Antarctica just off of Queen Maud Land. Following this initial sighting, Fabian and his team circumnavigated Antarctica twice, and even spent time on land, briefly exploring all of the beauty Antarctica had to offer. But besides just sightseeing, while in Antarctica, Fabian and his team also conducted scientific work and began officially mapping this continent that prior to this time only existed in theory and mythology. Now, while it's not extremely relevant, I figured it was worth mentioning that even though Fabian Bellingshausen is most commonly credited as the first to spot and discover Antarctica, there were 2 other explorers that also witnessed Antarctica within the same year. Edward Bransfield was a British explorer who sighted the Antarctic Peninsula only 3 days after Fabian witnessed the ice shelf, and later that same year in November, Nathaniel Palmer, an American explorer, also sighted the Arctic Peninsula, which is pretty interesting. It almost reminds me of an early version of the space race. But of course, instead of going to space, they went to ice. But this is where things truly begin to get weird. Because, like many things in this life, fact is stranger than fiction. And while it was weird to have this hypothesized continent existing at the bottom of the Earth, finding out that it existed only made things a lot more complex. And this is because, after the newly discovered existence of Antarctica, we quickly see a stark contrast in who is allowed to go to Antarctica and what they are allowed to do there. Following its initial discovery in the 1820s, basically all the way until the 1920s, almost every Antarctic expedition that took place was actually a private or commercial endeavor, usually consisting of sealing expeditions with the intention of securing massive amounts of seal furs for the fur trade that was flourishing back in North America. However, following 1920, we quickly see an increased amount of government involvement in Antarctica, with a few notable governments being United States, France, Norway, Germany, we'll get to that, Japan, Chile, Argentina, and more. And it was with this elevated government involvement, coupled with the geopolitical strain happening during World War II, that many of the countries involved with Antarctica decided that there needed to be a set of ground rules. And while that line of thinking may seem logical, it's that same set of ground rules that has more or less become a breeding ground for endless conspiracy theories about what's truly going on in Antarctica. Mainly because while this treaty itself doesn't inherently restrict tourism, it does heavily regulate it, making a location that's already extremely difficult to visit that much more difficult. And in most cases, the main result of this treaty was that if you are not a top-level scientist or an extremely wealthy individual, you have basically no chance of visiting Antarctica. However, even if you are one of the lucky few that is able to make it onto this elusive continent, your time, actions, and experiences are all heavily regulated and highly monitored, which, once again, only stokes the flames in the conspiracy theory fire. And while I'm of course going to dive deep into the official narrative, as well as outline the specifics of this now infamous treaty signed over 67 years ago, I thought it could be fun if we first explore some of the most popular conspiracy theories surrounding this treaty in the entire continent of Antarctica as a whole, before I inevitably kill the fun and reveal the man behind the curtain by discussing the official narrative. But we're not there yet, so let's put on our tinfoil hats and have some fun. Antarctic conspiracies. Unsurprisingly, almost all of these conspiracy theories orbit around the thought that the reason why Antarctica is so restricted is to solely prevent you and the general public from learning the truth. And the definition of what that truth looks like depends on which conspiracy theory you subscribe to, which is why I'm going to briefly explain a handful now, in varying levels of detail. because realistically, each of these conspiracy theories have much more lore than any factual event could possibly have, which, if nothing else, at least makes them interesting. Let's get started. The first conspiracy theory as to why the government is preventing people from exploring Antarctica more is pretty multifaceted, and basically claims that the Earth is actually hollow. Within that hollow Earth, there is a lost ancient civilization, and one of the primary ways of reaching that hollow Earth is through a network of entrances across the world, many of which existing in Antarctica. I hope you're following along, because we are just getting started. According to this theory, the ancient civilization that lives within this hollow Earth is known as Agartha. And without getting too much into Agartha lore, while it is complex, convoluted, and varies pretty drastically, the core thoughts, at least from my understanding, are that this underground civilization is led by a figure known as the King of the World, and secretly influences the surface world through Agartha in the middle of the hollow Earth. And I guess if you subscribe to this theory, the main reason why the government doesn't want you learning about this truth is because they of course want to keep you unaware of the reality of the world and the true powers that be. At least, I'm assuming. I couldn't find much more explanation to why there would be so much secrecy, besides the government or the powers that be wanting to maintain the official narrative of history in a way that is most beneficial for them. And while that premise on its own may have more validity, I don't think it necessarily proves the existence of a hollow Earth or an ancient civilization within it. However, even in the biggest lies, there is always a kernel of truth. And in the case of ancient civilizations under the Antarctic, while there isn't provable evidence of such a thing, there is an interesting phenomenon that could bolster that theory for some people. Without getting too far into the weeds about science jargon, there is essentially very strange heat signatures that have been detected far underground near the South Pole. This high geothermal activity is not only mysterious, but significant, because it has actually been melting ice at the bottom of the ice sheet in Antarctica. And with that melted ice, it has created massive lakes, rivers, and even caverns at the very bottom of the ice sheet that stands anywhere from 1 to 5 kilometers tall across the entirety of Antarctica. And of course, when you have strange heat signatures under kilometers of ice in one of the most remote and regulated parts of the world, you're of course going to breed, once again, conspiracy theories. And it's been this geothermal activity that has of course added validity, at least in the minds of some individuals, that Agartha is in fact real, or that something else may actually be at play. Another theory we'll discuss soon. But to briefly discuss a bit of science, many of these heat signatures have not only been studied, but also explained by scientists as nothing more than volcanic and geothermal activity. And it's because of that the widely accepted explanation for all of these heat signatures is that this is simply part of a natural geographical process that we understand partially, but not fully. And the reason I say that is because researchers don't fully understand all of these heat signatures, specifically because most of them are not consistent with patterns we've seen basically anywhere else on Earth, which could mean that there's an ancient civilization down there, or it could just possibly mean that there's a geological process we're not familiar with because we're typically not researching underneath a massive sheet of ice in the most isolated continent in the world. But I digress. If the Earth being hollow and an ancient civilization existing underneath the Antarctic ice was too crazy for you, allow me to introduce the next theory. The second theory proposes that no, there's not a hollow Earth and there's not an ancient civilization within that Earth. All there is that's hidden in Antarctica is a massive Nazi bunker that not only exists to test and develop advanced technologies, but also uses it as a base to study alien technology and communicate with said aliens. Depending on which version of this theory you're exposed to, the alien part may or may not be present. But I thought I'd mention it because I thought it was extra interesting. But what's also interesting is that in some flavors of this conspiracy theory, it's even believed that this base in Antarctica was used to harbor and protect high-ranking Nazi officials after World War II, including Adolf Hitler, which is its own can of worms. However, while this theory may seem out there is once again another kernel of truth. And this time, that kernel's a bit larger. Prior and during World War II, between 1938 and 1939, Nazi Germany did carry out a massive Antarctic expedition. And during this expedition, the Nazis mapped nearly 350 square kilometers of territory and also dropped thousands of swastika markers all across Antarctica, claiming land for Germany. Now, while the official reason for this expedition was to help Germany establish its own supply of whales and whale oil so they weren't dependent on other European countries, as well as strengthening territorial interests. Officially, all Antarctic Nazi bases were abandoned in 1945 after the Axis powers lost World War II. However, if you ask a group of certain individuals, the Nazis didn't go to Antarctica for whaling, and they potentially never left. You see, according to the second conspiracy theory, during their time in Antarctica, the Nazis built a secret underground bunker known as Base 211. And as I alluded to previously, this was a base specifically used to protect high-ranking Nazi officials after the Second World War and was used during the Second World War to develop advanced technologies, including experimental flying saucers and other aircraft that are rather reminiscent of, well, alien spacecraft. And while there's no direct evidence to validate any of these claims, there is other historical events that took place around the same time, around the same place, that people like to draw connections to. One notable example being Operation High Jump, which took place in 1946 and was the largest Antarctic expedition ever conducted. Operation High Jump was conducted by the US military to train personnel and test equipment in polar conditions, as well as to gain a greater knowledge about Antarctica as a whole. However, people that subscribe to this conspiracy theory believe that Operation High Jump was actually a mission to go wipe out all Nazi bases in Antarctica. And when you learn that the US government did send 4,700 people, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft to Antarctica, it could seem plausible that they were doing a little bit more than training, at least to some. Things get even more interesting though when you learn that Operation High Jump was cut short many months early, officially due to poor weather conditions. Although, once again, others believe that the reason they left early was because one of the Americans involved in this operation was actually taken into the Hollow Earth, once again from the first conspiracy, and was met with an advanced civilization of tall individuals that essentially warned him that humanity was at risk if we continued to use nuclear weapons. And it's allegedly stated that that individual, Robert E. Byrd, wrote about his encounter with these Hollow Earth individuals in his diary. However, once again, there's no verifiable proof of any of that. And whether Byrd experienced a Hollow Earth civilization, resistance from Antarctic Nazis, or even a UFO experience is something we may never know. And while basically all of those are extremely unlikely, they aren't not believed by some. And to quickly touch on a few other brief examples, some people believe that the main reason why governments across the globe don't want you visiting Antarctica freely is because there's either too much ancient evidence from previous civilizations on the surface, or there's too much alien activity happening underground, and for that reason, they can't risk civilians getting too close to it and learning the truth. Some individuals claim that there are pyramids and other like structures on the surface of Antarctica. However, scientists have more or less been able to debunk most of these theories, pointing out that these structures that look like pyramids are actually simply naturally formed mountains. But as we all know, they're trying to hide the truth from you, right? But in case a hollow Earth was too out there for you, how about a flat Earth? To some, the main reason why Antarctica is so protected and so restricted is simply because there is no Antarctica. There is simply a large rim of ice around the entire planet that holds all the water in and keeps us safe from falling off the edge of our flat planet. And most people in the days when Antarctica was being first discovered knew that the Earth was very much so round. If you did happen to be a flat earther who believed this theory, reading the quote from the first Russian expedition that proved the existence of Antarctica, claiming that he saw a massive, tall sheet of ice, probably wouldn't make you believe in a round Earth. It would very likely only bolden your flat Earth beliefs. Now, with all of that being said, and a general understanding of some of the alternative perspectives about what's really going on in Antarctica, I think it's only fair if we now dive deeper into the official narrative, to see if potentially what we're being told has any validity, and also to see if the official narrative sounds even half as believable as some of these alternative theories. Antarctic actualities. I figured the best place to start when discussing the official narrative is, of course, the official documentation. And what better place to start than this elusive treaty that, of course, had the intention of hiding so much banned knowledge from the general public. As I mentioned previously, on December 1st of 1959, over 12 countries came together to all sign a treaty known as the Antarctic Treaty. These countries included Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and even the United States. And it's a bit noteworthy that all of these countries came together, specifically the Soviet Union and the United States, because this treaty literally took place during the Cold War, definitely proving that this treaty was very important. Although the treaty was signed in 1959, it wasn't entered into force until June 23rd, 1961. And when it was put into force, the stated main goal of this treaty was to prevent Antarctica from becoming a zone of conflict, territorial dispute, or a place of military activity. And to me, that makes a lot of sense, especially considering the fact that this was during the Cold War, a time of heightened global tensions, and also not long after the Second World War, where we literally saw the Nazis building bases and putting swastikas all over the place willy-nilly. To me, that goal sounds pretty noble. Although, when we are discussing global governments and nobility, things can get a bit muddy. But that's besides the point. The actual treaty itself is relatively short, only containing 14 articles. Although, all of these articles pretty clearly reflect the publicly stated goal of the treaty as a whole, which I will briefly summarize in order now. Article 1. Peaceful purposes only. Antarctica can only be used for peaceful purposes, and it explicitly bans any form of military activity. Article 2. Freedom of science investigation. Any scientific research and any international cooperation for that scientific research should and can continue in Antarctica without any restriction. The third article is data sharing and claims that all scientific observations and results must be freely shared and exchanged to all parties present in Antarctica. And the fourth article claims frozen sovereignty, no pun intended, essentially meaning no country can claim any territory of Antarctica for its own. At least, no new claims. Technically, 7 countries have claimed territory in Antarctica, but with the establishment of this treaty, these claims are not recognized or rejected. It's essentially neutral, which to me doesn't make much sense. The fifth article outright bans nuclear activity of any kind in Antarctica. No nuclear weapons and no nuclear waste. And the final article that I think is worth mentioning is Article 7, which essentially states that any party that is a member of the treaty has access to inspect any station, ship, or aircraft of any other party at any time. Nothing is off limits. You have to give access to any other party in Antarctica to anything you have in Antarctica, essentially in the name of freedom of science and information. And outside of those articles in the initially signed treaty, there was additional protocols that were enacted much later on, such as the Madrid Protocol, which was added in 1991. And this entire protocol was created in the name of environmental protection, or so they claim. The Madrid Protocol designated Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. And within this protocol came strict regulation for tourism, the banning of mining of any sort, as well as large-scale assessments of the environmental impacts of Antarctica on the world and of human activity in Antarctica. Realistically, we could get really deep into the weeds into massive, multinational legal jargon. But the overarching point of the original Antarctic Treaty was to neutralize and demilitarize a massive, uninhabited continent before things got too crazy, which in my opinion makes a lot of sense, especially considering the time the treaty was signed. And of course, over time, inevitably, more laws and regulations were put into place. However, in the case of additional protocols being added into the Antarctic Treaty System, basically everything that was added was in the name of protecting the extremely fragile ecosystem that exists in Antarctica, a place that has existed longer than humans have ever existed, meaning it likely contains secrets we are completely unaware of. However, whether those secrets are ancient Nazi aliens or simply fragile life forms in a remote environment is completely up to you to decide. But to answer the overarching question in this entire video, if you want to be honest about why you can't go to Antarctica, you first need to understand that you can go to Antarctica, and that there is no formal ban of travel to Antarctica by any one group. However, because of the multinational treaty with the intention of protecting the ecosystem, as well as tourists looking to experience it, there are a plethora of regulations and rules put in place, once again, for the safety of the ecosystem and the traveler. And realistically, one of the biggest factors keeping people away from Antarctica is simply the geographic reality. There's essentially no residential development in Antarctica. It is extremely remote and desolate. The temperatures and overall weather conditions are extremely brutal, and even the most convenient methods of traveling to Antarctica are expensive and time-consuming. Meaning that while yes, there are plenty of governmental regulations associated with Antarctica, another equally large factor is simply nature itself. Now, with all of that being said, I will concede a couple of things. It is a bit strange that almost all of a sudden, we had 12 initial countries, over 56 countries now, all agree to the same treaty, and I also find it interesting that Antarctica is basically the only place in the world where the government goes out of their way to care about the environment and your personal safety. However, while this treaty definitely seems convenient, in most cases, people's imaginations run wild simply because there are so many questions we simply don't know in regards to Antarctica, and our monkey brains love to try to fill the gaps. And I think one of the best ways to summarize this video is that while yes, most people will never visit Antarctica, it's not because they're not allowed. Going to Antarctica has always been hard. And in the olden days, you had limited technology but unlimited freedoms, making Antarctica essentially the Wild West for some time. Let's call it the Wild South. However, in the modern day, when traveling to Antarctica, technology is seemingly unlimited, however, freedoms are very limited. making private expeditions basically just as hard as they've always been, but for much different reasons. Now, whether or not the government's trying to keep a neutral zone on this globe and protect fragile environments, or they're simply just trying to keep you from ancient Nazi aliens, I'll leave up to you. But if you leave this video learning one thing, let it be this. You can travel to Antarctica. However, the reason you can't do whatever you want there is still debated and maybe forever. The craziest revenge stories in human history. The year is 1860, and it was a crisp October evening in Hartford, Connecticut. A young, loving couple sat beside their fire in their relatively modest shack, anxiously awaiting the delivery of their new baby boy. And while these soon-to-be parents would be overjoyed to have a baby that is nothing more than happy, healthy, and ordinary, little did they know the son that they were just about to have would not only be extraordinary, but would literally become something of legend. And after hours of torturous labor, this legend was born, with the official birthday of October 26th, 1860, and the legal name of Frank Boardman Eden. Although it was the alias he was given later in life that would become his globally recognized name. Frank was a normal and happy child. He enjoyed playing with his friends, he enjoyed time outside, and he particularly enjoyed spending quality time with his father, at least as much as he could get. At the age of 8, Frank and his family moved from Hartford, Connecticut down to Twin Mound, Kansas. And this move, unfortunately, was a turning point in Frank's life. Shortly after Frank and his family moved to Kansas, it was obvious they did not fit in. Frank's father was an abolitionist, although the city they moved to had a pretty strong Confederate population. And during this time, those two did not get along at all. Now, while Frank was initially upset about the move, he quickly made new friends in Kansas, and it almost seemed like his new home. Although, for Frank's parents, it was somewhat obvious that trouble was brewing. Although, they kept their fears away from Frank. That was until they couldn't anymore. Not even 1 year after moving to Kansas, Frank's father was shot dead in cold blood by 6 former Confederate soldiers. These former soldiers were part of a vigilante Southerners group who called themselves the Regulators, and they believed it was totally acceptable to use violence on your political enemies. The news of his father passing devastated both Frank and his mother. Frank's mother was concerned about how she would make ends meet and how she would take care of her boy on her own, and Frank had no idea what life would be like without his best friend. After the murder, many members of the community went to visit their new neighbors and pay their condolences. But it was one man who visited the family that left a particular impact on Frank. This man was named Moses Beeman. He was a friend of Frank's father, and he had one important message for Frank. During his visit, he took Frank in a separate room, sat him down, looked him dead in the eye, and told him the following. "My boy, may an old man's curse rest upon you if you do not try to avenge your father." He said nothing else to the 8-year-old child. He hugged his mother, and he left the house, leaving Frank with a heavy heart and a confused mind. The following week, Moses returned, although he didn't have an order. This time, he had an objective. He took Frank into the backyard, set up some cans on a fence post, and pulled out a gun. At this point, Frank had seen guns but was not familiar, and was more or less traumatized by the thought of handling a gun, due to how his late father died. Although Moses ensured it was okay and safe, and the two began to shoot. And from the age of 8 to 15, Frank, both with Moses and by himself, took shooting very seriously, and very quickly gained expert levels of marksmanship, with no formal training. At the age of 15, Frank decided that it was time to get formal training. He, although being young in modern standards, felt like a man at the time. He had been taking care of his mother for years now, and he felt like the time was right. Frank set out to visit Fort Gibson in Oklahoma. Although when Frank arrived at the fort, he was quickly turned away, being told he was too young to join the army. Feeling like it was too late to turn back, Frank felt desperate. And it was at that moment that he looked the colonel dead in the eyes and told him, "I know I can't join the army yet, but I just need to learn how to shoot. Please, even for a day, take me in. For all you know, I might even be a better shot than some of your soldiers." And while the colonel saw this as disrespect, he also saw this as a challenge. And he took Frank in to humble him. During his time in the fort, Frank reportedly outshot everybody in the fort, and even kept up with the top marksmen in the army. Frank stayed for much longer than he anticipated and participated in many shooting competitions at the fort. So many, in fact, that the commanding officer and that same colonel, John J. Coppener, gave Frank a marksmanship badge and also gave him the now legendary nickname of Pistol Pete. After spending years practicing at home and now having the affirmation of the government for being an extremely skilled marksman, Frank felt emboldened to act on the mission he was given as an 8-year-old boy. Remembering what Moses told him in the hours Moses spent with him, he knew what he had to do. And over the next decade, Frank hunted down and killed every single one of his father's murderers, except for one, who unfortunately passed away before Frank could get to him. After seemingly accomplishing his mission, Frank felt proud and once again lost, and he ended up settling in Oklahoma and decided to use his skills for good and became a sheriff and later a blacksmith. And he also went on to become married, have 9 kids, 31 grandkids, and even live long enough to see 3 of his great-great-grandchildren. Frank, or Pistol Pete, passed away on April 8th, 1958, at the ripe age of 97. And while he has been gone for decades now, his story is definitely still around. And in my opinion, it's one of the coolest revenge stories of human history. But we're also just getting started. I don't know, I really wanted to start the story with Pistol Pete because I thought the story was so cool. You know, almost like a Batman vibe. Like, he was literally given the task as an 8-year-old boy, hey, you have to kill everybody who killed your father or you will be cursed. Like, that's a crazy thing to say to an 8-year-old, but he did it. He took it seriously, he learned marksmanship, he avenged his father, and then used his skills for good. But on top of just being a legend for that, Frank was also a legend for being very personable. And he was so personable and outgoing, in fact, that him riding a horse in a parade in 1923 is the reason why Oklahoma State University has the mascot of Pistol Pete. Students of what would later become Oklahoma State University literally saw Frank on a horse, being Frank and just doing outrageous things and being outgoing, and decided that this guy is the perfect representation of our school. And for that reason, they petitioned to change the mascot, and well, the rest is history. Because it wouldn't be until 1958 that a caricature of Frank known as Pistol Pete would become the official mascot. And the now iconic logo was not even a licensed symbol until the 1980s, obviously long after Frank passed away. Since Frank's passing, he has won multiple awards. Most notably, in 1997, he was inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, and in 2022, he was inducted into the Hall of Great Westerners at the National Cowboy Western Heritage Center in Oklahoma. And literally only last year, in 2025, he was also inducted into the Oklahoma State University Hall of Fame, further proving that Pistol Pete is a legend. And in Oklahoma, he is very much so appreciated. Frank had a normal upbringing, but because of unfortunate circumstances outside of his control, his father was taken from him and he was given a mission he would go on to fulfill and then live a long, prosperous life. Honestly, that's how you make lemonade out of lemons. But we're only just getting started and we have more stories to get into. The year is 963. Harold Bluetooth, the King of Denmark, and his wife were both awaiting the delivery of their son. Although this time, they weren't in a modest shack. They were in a quite luxurious castle. After hours of grueling labor and beating all odds, the queen survived, and the baby boy was born happy and healthy. And his name was Sweyn Forkbeard. Growing up as the son of the King of Denmark, Sweyn had a much different upbringing than most Danes. Sweyn was born into one of the most iconic bloodlines in all of Viking history, and it was for this reason that he had massive shoes to fill. Fortunately, due to his unique upbringing, he was exposed to knowledge and education that most Danes could never dream of, and it was this experience in his early life that set him up for success as a strong leader. Without having really any recorded facts of the upbringing of Sweyn, there's not much to report about his early life, besides the fact that it is very likely that he was exposed to warfare, strategy, and swordsmanship at a very young age, and this was proven later in life. As Sweyn began to develop from a young boy to a young man, he began to have more and more tension with his father, or at least his father figure, because it is believed that Harold Bluetooth is likely not the biological father of Sweyn, but more likely the stepfather, with the biological father being Harold's brother who passed away before Sweyn was ever born, marrying his brother's widow and taking on the child as his own. That, on a surface level, seems admirable, although, as we will go on to learn, this decision was likely his downfall. As Sweyn grew from a young boy to a young man, he felt he was ready to take on responsibility, and Sweyn approached his father, asking him for a piece of Denmark, something that he could own and rule and practice his kingsmanship in, although Bluetooth denied the request, and Sweyn took this rejection as an act of war. Sweyn quickly decided that he only had one option if he truly wanted to gain power, and that was to take it. And shortly after this denial, he began gathering an army, telling Bluetooth that he was going to go on a raid at some point. However, in reality, the swords he was collecting were going to be pointed at his father. Now, the reason why Sweyn went to such extreme lengths to betray his father are debated, although it's not believed that he tried to overthrow his father simply just because he was denied land. It is believed that it was the combination of this land denial on top of another factor that caused, well, such a violent overthrowing, which we will discuss. Those two additional factors that are debated, well, are the following. Some believe that it was around this time where Sweyn found out that Bluetooth was not his true biological father, therefore emboldening him to overthrow Bluetooth because he was the true heir to the throne, not Bluetooth. And the other belief is that Sweyn simply did not like the Christianization of Denmark, and that's because Bluetooth was the first king of Denmark to be baptized and accept Christianity as the primary religion, something that rubbed Sweyn the wrong way, because he held the pagan Viking traditions and beliefs closely to his heart, and his Christianization seemed like a betrayal. Unfortunately, we may never know what the true reasons were. Regardless, a large-scale battle took place. Bluetooth's army actually won the battle. However, Bluetooth sustained a massive injury during the battle and died shortly after. And because of this, Sweyn was now made the king of Denmark, supposedly at the age of 23. During Sweyn's time as the king of Denmark, he was involved in multiple large-scale historic battles, each of which are worthy of a video on their own. But to summarize the next few decades, Sweyn used his might and strategy to take over significant parts of Norway, so much of the fact that he actually became the king of Norway as well in the year 1999, and then set his sights on England. However, the English were not so happy to have the Danes on their land. And it was because of the English's disdain for the Danes in England that the King of England at the time, King Ethelred the Unready, ordered the massacre and mass murder of all of the Danes in England. This event was known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, and it took place in November of 1002. This massacre was undoubtedly tragic for the Danes in England and their families back home, and one of the most notable individuals impacted by this massacre was Sweyn Forkbeard, because both his brother and sister were murdered in this massacre. And it was these exact murders that gave Sweyn the motivation and justification to let all hell break loose on England. And that he did. Sweyn was already occupying parts of England because of the prospect of revenue. Although now with this newfound justification, they wanted not just parts of England, they wanted to rule the entire country. And from the year 1002 to the year 1012, Sweyn engaged in 3 different full-scale battles on England. And by the end of the following year, 1013, Sweyn became the official King of England by means of conquest, making him the king of a 3rd consecutive country, the King of Denmark, the King of Norway, and now the King of England. And with the conquest of this final country, he was able to enact his revenge. Because although the King of England took a brother and a sister from Sweyn Forkbeard, Sweyn took the crown and the country from the King of England, something he likely planned on doing anyway. Although with this added motivation, I'm sure it made the revenge that much sweeter. The full detailed story of Sweyn Forkbeard is obviously something I can't go into in this video. Although I'm really hoping this brief summary gave a pretty good overlook on how one man could lose some siblings, but gain a country. Now, I'm definitely not going to say Sweyn seemed like an innocent, harmless individual. He was a ruthless ruler, and it appears he partook and engaged in some of the very much so common brutality of his day. Although, when a king decides it's acceptable to exterminate an entire group of people, there needs to be pushback. Unfortunately, the King of England just happened to mess with the wrong Viking. Now, I would be lying if I didn't tell the full story, because shortly after taking the crown in England, Sweyn did die. And he died, unfortunately, only 40 days after becoming the King of England, giving him only limited time to enjoy everything he had worked for. It's like they say, is it better to have loved and lost, or never loved at all? In my opinion, the story of Sweyn Forkbeard is so interesting. And the fact that he was the king of 3 countries at once, to me, is mind-blowing. And sure, the guy, overthrew his dad, or stepdad, we don't really know. But when somebody kills your brother and sister, either in law or by blood, taking that individual's crown and country in retaliation seems like pretty sweet revenge. And yet, there's still more to discuss. The year is 1783. 2 new American immigrants had just given birth to their baby boy in Pennsylvania. And I don't know why baby boy is such a cliche in this video. I did not intend this. Regardless, 2 Irish-Scottish immigrants had just given birth to their baby boy. His name was Hugh, and he was about to become, once again, a legend. Hugh's early life is not necessarily well known, although he is extremely famous for what happened near the end of his life. In his early life, Hugh set out to become an explorer, and on one of his expeditions, he was actually essentially enslaved by pirates when his ship was overtaken by pirates, and he was given the ultimatum of either dying or becoming a pirate and fighting with them. He chose life and unfortunately spent multiple years as a pirate doing pirate things. On one of his missions, Hugh decided to ditch his pirate crew and spend time with some of the Native Americans that he had met in Texas. Now, he wasn't intentionally trying to be in Texas, the pirates were simply here, and he decided to just jump ship. Interestingly, the Native Americans that he had met were not fans of pirates whatsoever, and for this reason, he was sentenced to death almost immediately when meeting these natives. It has been reported that right before his execution by the natives, Hugh was able to offer these natives an expensive dye that they could use to dye garments and for war paints, and this was enough to spare his life. And because of this transaction, he was able to not only live, but spend the next couple of years living amongst this tribe, a time when he was able to hone in his skills as a hunter and outdoorsman. After Hugh spent multiple years as a pirate and then multiple years as a tribesman, Hugh decided it was time for something new. And it was at this time that he left the group of natives he was living with and decided to travel to St. Louis, Missouri in 1821. At this point, Hugh had been on this earth for nearly 40 years and had lived a full life for many up until this point. Although it was this move that he made to St. Louis that would truly cement Hugh Glass as a legend, at least in terms of revenge stories. The following year, after moving to St. Louis, Missouri, Hugh noticed an advertisement in the newspaper, the Missouri Gazette. The advertisement was commissioned by William Henry Ashley, and the advertisement was calling for 100 men to ascend the river Missouri as part of a fur trading venture. And to Hugh, somebody who's lived a rather storied life up until this point, this career opportunity not only sounded exciting, but also seemed like something that was directly within his skill set. And so he decided to respond to the advertisement and get the job. Him and 99 other men, of course. The group of men that ended up getting hired for this position became known as Ashley's 100, which, if you ask me, kind of sounds like another crazy OnlyFans challenge, but we'll put that to the side. These Ashley's 100 were some of the most rugged and skilled mountain men that Missouri had to offer. And once the group was fully organized, the following year, they had started their expedition. An expedition that would be longer and harder than Glass could ever imagine. The expedition was almost instantly met with resistance from Native Americans. It was reported that the Americans tried to initiate trade, but were met with violence, which resulted in an all-out war against this native settlement and, well, these traveling traders. The result of this conflict was the entire village being burned down, everyone dying on the native side, and a vast majority of the Ashley 100 dying as well. Following this all-out war on the tribe, Hugh and 13 other men continued their journey to the Yellowstone River, where they intended to trap and fur beavers. To me, that fact alone is crazy, that they literally had a full-scale war during this expedition, and they, just continued to get beaver pelts of all things. Regardless, it wouldn't be this all-out war with the native tribes that would be the source of revenge. That betrayal and revenge would actually come from within the Ashley 100. Once Hugh and the 13 other men finally arrived in Yellowstone, the men split up and began looking for furs. And that was when Hugh stumbled upon an ominously quiet clearing right outside of a small creek. And this area, unfortunately, turned out to be a bear's nest and resulted in Hugh Glass being mauled by a bear severely. This angry, aggressive mother bear threw him to the ground and then pinned him down as she bit into Hugh, threw chunks of his meat to her cubs, and then her cubs also began to attack Hugh as well. To call this bear attack brutal is an understatement, and by the time that his fellow hunters and trappers were able to kill the bears, Hugh was essentially a shell of a man and wasn't even believed to be alive. Although, shockingly, upon further inspection, Hugh was breathing and somehow still alive. Although, just because he was alive now didn't mean he would be alive for long. And because of this, the other men put Hugh on a stretcher and began carrying him, assuming that they would carry him for the day, set up camp, sleep, and in the morning he would be dead and they could bury him. Although, after a day of carrying him, and then after sleeping through the night and finding him still alive, the group decided that it didn't make sense to carry him all the way home, because he obviously wouldn't survive. And the group decided to move on, but they did leave 2 people to watch over Hugh's body so that they could give him a proper burial once he did pass away. These 2 men, Fitzgerald, an older man, and Bridger, a younger boy, only a teen, both watched over Hugh for 5 consecutive days. And shockingly, Hugh survived every single one of those days. Although, to his team members, this was not a miracle. This was a liability. Because these men were still in the middle of the wilderness, and they knew that they had bears and also angry native tribes on their tail. And these men were growing more anxious by the day. And it was on that 5th day that these men decided that they had to abandon Hugh. And that they did. They took his gun and everything of value off his person besides his clothes and left him to die by a creek. However, Hugh didn't die. And what he did next made him the legend that we likely are all familiar with today. And if you've seen the movie The Revenant, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Following being abandoned, Hugh surprisingly was able to come to and regained some form of consciousness, although his body was simply not cooperating. He had multiple broken ribs, a broken arm, a broken leg, and was truly in horrendous shape. However, he did have enough strength to drink water out of the stream, eat berries off of bushes, and gather enough nutrition to sustain himself. And with berries in his belly, he came to terms with the fact that he had been abandoned by his team. And with this realization, he became enraged. So enraged, in fact, that he decided that he would make it back to his camp and confront those men that abandoned him at any cost. And with that, he began the multiple 100-mile trek, starting with just crawling and eventually being able to hobble and walk the entirety of the way. After somehow surviving and maneuvering over 240 miles, Hugh reached a fur trading outpost where he was able to hitch a boat ride back to his original camp. And this was fortunate because this boat ride alone was an additional 300 miles, something that he likely would not have survived on foot. Regardless, after this boat ride, Hugh and the French fur traders he was with were attacked by another Native American tribe, although they were also defended by a separate Native American tribe. And the result of this all-out conflict was the death of everybody in Hugh's camp except for himself. And these Native Americans that saved his life and fought on his behalf, once again, delivered him directly to a separate trading post where he was offered the opportunity to rest, but he did not take it because he had not yet achieved his goal of getting his revenge. Now, mind you, this was 6 months after the bear attack at this point. Everybody who had ever known Hugh would have likely believed he was dead. Although, little did they know, Hugh was very much so alive, and the two men that abandoned him were about to get an earful, to say the least. Shortly after this encounter, Hugh finally made it to Fort Henry, the fort where his original company was supposed to be. And it was there where Hugh ran into Bridger, one of the two men that abandoned him. Although Bridger was not a man, he was a boy. And after Hugh talked to Bridger, he came to the conclusion that Bridger was a bystander. He was simply only following orders and did not intentionally betray Hugh. And because of this, after a harsh winter, Hugh decided to once again continue his journey to find Fitzgerald. He joined another mission to go 400 miles upstream to a new trading post where Fitzgerald was supposed to be, and he was well on his way to get his revenge. Although, once this boat had landed, it was once again attacked by another group of Native Americans. Most of his group died, and Hugh was once again left, I'm not even joking, to his own devices, where he was injured, alone, and had to walk hundreds of miles. After nearly a year of pain, torture, suffering, and, well, anger, Hugh was finally able to run into Fitzgerald at a settlement known as Fort Atkinson. However, at this fort, it was revealed that Fitzgerald had joined the United States Army. And if Hugh wanted to get revenge on Fitzgerald, it would be a death sentence, because killing a soldier was a crime punishable by execution. Although, I don't think Hugh needed to kill Fitzgerald to get his point across, because I'm sure for Fitzgerald, even seeing Hugh would have been shocking. But beyond just making his presence and, well, being alive known to Fitzgerald, Hugh also told Fitzgerald that while he can't kill him now, if he ever leaves the army, he will personally kill Fitzgerald. And while to some that may not sound like the most satisfying revenge, being able to come face to face to the man who abandoned you and not kill him, but to tell him, hey, I'm alive, I survived everything, and I'm not going to kill you. A, because I can't, but B, because you might have worse things coming to you. And while death is a harsh punishment, war is no walk in the park. And I would personally like to believe that being able to overcome and survive everything that Hugh did, coming face to face with the person that abandoned him and telling him off, and being the bigger man was likely the most satisfying thing he could have done in that situation. But for all I know, he could also have just been extremely mad that he was a soldier and was avidly waiting for him to, not be a soldier anymore so he could get his real revenge. But I'll leave that for you guys to decide in the comments. Regardless, hopefully this extremely oversimplified version of the story of Hugh Glass paints just a small picture of how much of a badass he truly was. And if you want to learn more about it, watch the movie The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio. Or if you want a more accurate depiction, read some historical documents. This guy went to hell and back multiple times and could never truly catch a break. Although he was able to survive seemingly the impossible, and he was able to come face to face with the man who left him for dead and tell him that he survived the impossible and that it was Fitzgerald's turn to survive war. The craziest scams in every time period. The Stone Age. Admittedly, this section is going to be rather short, for a couple of reasons. Primarily being that the Stone Age is literally prehistoric, meaning that everything I'm about to discuss is essentially speculative. Also, because most of human life in the Stone Age was extremely simple, meaning that at this point, human life wasn't even able to comprehend the possibility of deception. If you had something that another human wanted, there was two options. Either they kill you to get the thing, or they die trying to kill you to get that thing. That was realistically the extent of scams in the Stone Age. Keep in mind, the Stone Age literally extends over 3.4 million years worth of history. The Stone Age contains 99.3% of all recorded human history, dating back around 300,000 years ago when Homo sapiens first appeared. So with that being said, what are some scams that could have possibly existed in the Stone Age? And let me present you a few interesting opportunities. Scam number 1, the made you look scam. Here's how the scam goes. You are a caveman, and your enemy, also a caveman, comes to ask you a question. You decide you've had enough of his antics and point in the direction that's behind him. This caveman turns around, you pull out your trusty club and hit him in the head. Now, your enemy is dead, and you have just successfully committed a Stone Age scam. In modern terms, that's not much of a scam at all. But when it comes to prehistoric humans, things were simple. Just think about that one episode of SpongeBob that took place in the prehistoric times. That's kind of what we're working with here. But besides the petty theft and petty murder of the Stone Age, I believe one of the biggest scams out of the Stone Age was actually the existence of the Stone Age itself. You see, the Stone Age primarily is defined by its use of stone tools, specifically near the very end of the Stone Age. And this is because humans using stone tools signifies the evolution of human creativity, human engineering, human development. Now, you may be thinking, well, of course, we need this human development. This isn't a scam at all. This is beautiful. This is progress. And what I would say to you is, not really. Because look where it's gotten us. As humans, we used to sleep outside under the stars, do whatever we wanted all day, go to the bathroom anywhere. We essentially lived like animals, and it was great. Just look how good your dog or cat has it right now. We used to live like them, but now we wake up to an alarm, we go to a job, we commute, we have anxiety, we have bills. Our bills even have bills at this point. So although this scam may have not taken place in the Stone Age, it definitely started in the Stone Age. And potentially one of the biggest scams of the Stone Age was that one meddling, weaselly little caveman that decided to combine a stick with a rock. And maybe if he was the one who got clubbed, we would still be living that sweet animalistic lifestyle. This first section was a bit silly, but I didn't want to leave this Stone Age out of a video about every time period. But with that being said, as we now transition into recorded history, the scams are going to be historically documented and much more serious. But this is a Trust Me Bro video, so don't expect a documentary. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron James. The Bronze Age. Not LeBron's Age. The Bronze Age. Yes, that was corny, and yes, we're keeping it in. We are now in the Bronze Age, the beginning of recorded scams. And the scam I'm going to be speaking about from the Bronze Age involves metal fraud, and also includes the earliest ever recorded customer complaint. Let me explain. The year is circa 1750 BC, right near the end of the Bronze Age. And there is a famous copper merchant named Ea Nasser. Ea Nasser, unsurprisingly, would buy and sell metals, specifically copper. And this merchant was no stranger to customer complaints, with one of the most famous examples coming from a customer named Nani. Nani's specific issue with Ea Nasser was that Ea Nasser was selling bad quality or low quality copper, and that was a big issue for Nani. Unlike the Stone Age, I'm not just making this up. This transaction and subsequent complaint is recorded in commercial tablets. These tablets were actually unearthed with a group of other tablets recording transactions and complaints about the copper quality. And these were all found in a home that was believed to at one point been owned by Ea Nasser, which is by itself just a really cool piece of history. Ea Nasser was a well-known copper merchant in his city and was even a member of an established and, relatively speaking, respected copper guild, meaning that he wasn't just any Joe Schmo. However, these credentials definitely didn't help him with his business dealings, because although he may have been surrounded by proper, integral copper merchants, Ea Nasser was likely nothing of the sort. And this is proven by the famous tablet sent to Ea Nasser from Nani, which has actually been translated, and I'm about to read exactly what Nani said to Ea Nasser, and I'll let you decide whether or not Ea Nasser was a scammer. The tablet reads as follows. When you came, you said to me as follows. I will give Gimosin fine quality copper ingots. You left, but then you did not do what you promised. You put ingots which were not good before my messenger and said, if you want to take them, take them. If you do not want to take them, go away. Who do you take me for, that you treat someone like me with such contempt? I have sent as messengers gentlemen like ourselves to collect the bag with my money, but you have treated me with contempt by sending them back empty-handed several times. And that through enemy territory. Is there anyone among the merchants who trade with Delmoon who has treated me in this way? You alone treat my messenger with contempt. On account of that one trifling mina of silver which I owe you, you feel free to speak in such a way. While I have given to the palace on your behalf 1,080 pounds of copper, and Shubi Abum has likewise given 1,080 pounds of copper, apart from what we had both had written on a sealed tablet to be kept in the temple of Shamash. How have you treated me for that copper? You have withheld my money bag from me in enemy territory. It is now up to you to restore my money to me in full. Take cognizance that from now on I will not accept here any copper from you that is not of fine quality. I shall from now on select and take the ingots individually in my own yard, and I shall exercise against you my right of rejection because you have treated me with contempt. That was long, but I wanted to give you the exact full quote because I think it's extremely interesting, and I think that Nani's being rather patient and has more than enough reason to be upset. To summarize, Nasir, at least to Nani, is selling low quality copper, and not only is he selling a low quality product, but he's promising a high quality product, and when questioned by the servants that are going to pick up the product, he is not nice at all. He's very combative within these transactions, and not only that, he's also refusing to give a full or even partial refund to Nani after his complaint, and Nani has sent multiple messengers to collect a refund. And what does Nasir do? Turns him away empty-handed and sends him through enemy territory to risk the life of the messenger just to add insult to injury for Nani. I don't know about you, but if I was Nani, I would definitely be sending somebody else to Nasir's door that wasn't a messenger looking for my money back. But even after all of this, Nani isn't even refusing to deal with Nasir anymore. He's just saying that once he gets the copper from Nasir, he's going to go through and verify the quality himself before he buys it, which is something he likely should have been doing, but I guess didn't feel like he had to be doing because he was buying from a merchant in the Copper Guild. But lesson learned on Nani's part, check your metal as you buy it. So yeah, this one tablet that was found thousands of years after it was created went on to solidify Nasir as one of the most notorious Bronze Age businessmen and scammers. Iron Age. The Iron Age is a very interesting time period, and it represents a change of power, at least in the world of metals, as the Iron Age literally represents iron becoming the prominent metal that is being mined, forged, and fashioned into tools and ornaments and armor. And the reason that transition was made is kind of a long story, but the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age was harsh, and humanity as a whole took a step backwards before it could take 2 steps forwards as it transitioned from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. However, the Iron Age is not free from scams, and it itself has a very interesting laundry list of scams that took place, with the one that I'm going to focus on involving silver coinage, debasement, and hyperinflation. Admittedly, the scam I'm about to discuss kind of bleeds out of the Iron Age, but I had other scams I wanted to associate with other time periods, so although this specific scam doesn't take place in the Iron Age, it definitely has its roots in the Iron Age. So I'm going to allow that technicality to make this work, because trust me, we do have some crazy scams coming up. The Iron Age is when we truly see the rise of coinage being used. During the mid to late Iron Age, we see coins being minted and being transacted with, which during this time in history, circa 600 BC, is a relatively new methodology of transacting, because up until this point, all of commerce was conducted through trade, one good for another. There was no store of value. It was simply merchandise for merchandise, no currency of any sort, at least in the form of coinage. Prior to coinage, precious metals were definitely the currency of choice, but they weren't necessarily currency, just something of value to most people, and a good way to store value efficiently, as they were non-perishable and value dense for the most part. Now, even during this time in the late Iron Age, these coins that were being made weren't even used for transacting yet. They were primarily religious objects, typically used as badges or medals. But it didn't take too long for these people that were creating these interesting, valuable medals to create something that had trade value. Specifically with ancient Greek coinage being minted by the Ionian Greeks in the late 6th century, right at the ass crack of the Iron Age. And it is believed that these ancient Greek coins were the first coins ever to be used for transacting on a large-scale basis, and they were made primarily of small silver fractions. But this recent innovation of commerce spread like wildfire through the 5th and 6th century BC, and quickly became the standard, primarily being pioneered by the ancient Greeks and other empires of the time. But this in itself isn't the scam. It's simply the context for the scam that we are about to discuss. This context is important because it anchors us to the Iron Age, although what we're about to discuss happens slightly after the Iron Age and involves actually the Roman Empire. During the Iron Age, ancient Rome is established, and during the end of the Iron Age, the Roman Republic is established. And during these times, the innovation with iron is giving Rome a lot of strength and a lot of military capability. And due to the rise of ancient Rome and then the Roman Republic, we find ourselves with the Roman Empire, which, like I mentioned, isn't in the Iron Age, but we're making it count. And it's with the Roman Empire that we find ourselves with our very next scam. The scam being coin debasement. And this one scam actually ended up being a contributing factor to the fall of the Roman Empire. By the time that the Roman Empire was established, coinage was in full effect and used effectively and worked as follows. Early coinage would be made out of pure or near pure materials, typically gold, silver, and copper. These ingots would be purchased, minted, and then sold into circulation with a face value slightly above their metal value. This allowed the government to make a small profit on every coin that they minted and also allowed the currency to keep a consistent value, as it had an intrinsic value of the metal it was made out of, while it also had a face value of only slightly above that, which everyone generally accepted. Coins typically varied in value from region to region, meaning that in simple modern terms, if you had a coin that had a face value of $2, but was, made out of $1.50's worth of silver, in your region, you can trade this for $2. But if you go to a different region where they have their own coinage, they're not going to accept your coinage at face value, but they'll take it at intrinsic value, meaning that your $2 coin in this new region is now worth $1.50. And this system actually incentivized local trade, as you are going to get the most bang for your buck. But the scam we are going to discuss is the debasement of coin that happened when the government wanted to inflate the number of coins that they could produce, and they tried to do so rather sneakily. There was two primary methods of debasement when they started to use this practice. When the government would mint these coins, they would either make them slightly lighter than they were supposed to be, meaning that they would mint a coin and then shave parts off of it to reclaim small scraps, or they would simply use a poor quality metal. This would save them money and make the coins that they're minting cheaper, while they would still be selling them for the same face value, giving the government extra funds. But these methods of debasement continued and began to progress and became more and more severe. What the Roman Empire began to do was start devaluing their coins by not making them a little lighter or using a lower quality material, but actually reducing the percentage of precious metals in the coins. Early coinage of the Roman Empire consisted of anywhere from 93 to 97% of the precious metal they were supposed to be. But it didn't take long for the government to reduce this number from 93% in 107 AD to 78.5% in 193 AD, and then to 35% in 254 AD, and then 20% in 257 AD, and then all the way down until 5% silver in 270 AD. The impact of this was obviously massive, as this massive influx of token supply and massive decline in intrinsic value of these tokens created hyperinflation, and runaway hyperinflation actually happened multiple times throughout the Roman Empire. As I mentioned before, most of this debasement would happen to fund military campaigns to try to get more land, more money, more power, and they likely justified this debasement by saying they were going to collect more wealth for the greater empire. Although what really happened was prices would rise, and the value of coins that everybody was collecting, holding, trading with was dropping significantly. And it wasn't unheard of for an army to go on a campaign, get paid their money, only to realize that once they go to spend their money, the big paycheck that they thought they had gotten is now only worth a few days' meals, which obviously put pressure between the government and the army, something that no government wants to have. I think it's important to note that in modern times, the creation of money and steady inflation is something we kind of just accept, and it's part of how our currency operates. However, at this time, each individual coin had an intrinsic value, and that was the backing of its value. And even if you paid for currency in your local region and took it to a different region, even if they did not accept your region's currency, they would still pay you what your precious metal was worth, meaning that your money could never go to nothing. I suppose to put it in a modern day context, imagine if the government just said, hey, actually it's cheaper to make $1 bills than it is to make $5 bills. So all new $1 bills are actually 5. And the government just wrote a 5 on a $1 bill. You can still see that it's a $1 bill, but you and everyone else is supposed to act like it's a $5 bill. That's going to create some suspiciousness. And even that, admittedly, is a bad analogy, because the currency that we use today all has the same intrinsic value of nothing, at least not in its physical form. With early coinage in the Iron Age, there was forgery, debasement, and fraud. But I wanted to cover the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire because I thought it was a great summary of what was brewing in the Iron Age at a major historical scale. scale. And while the Roman Empire did not exist in the Iron Age, ancient Rome did. And I'm making this point abundantly clear to prevent any sort of misinformation. And truthfully, the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire was the best example of coin debasement I could find. So I decided to take a story out of the future and apply it to the Iron Age to make this section the best it could be. So yeah, Rome was formed in the Iron Age, coins were formed in the Iron Age, but likely the most famous example of coin debasement and hyperinflation happened a little after and involved the Roman government literally scamming its people by making the currency cheaper and worse while still maintaining the same face value. And well, it backfired on everybody. The Classical Era. Although we are now in the Classical Era, the scam that we're about to discuss is anything but classy and actually contains what is believed to be the first instance of insurance fraud, which is just great to hear that people have been committing insurance fraud for thousands of years. Perhaps insurance fraud is just in our DNA. In the Classical Era, there was a man in ancient Greece known as Hegestratos, and he was a little bit of a knucklehead. During roughly 5th century BCE, near the beginning of the Classical Era, maritime trade was booming. Hegestratos was a ship owner and was profiting from this maritime trade that was taken off. And because he had a big and beautiful and shiny ship, he decided that it would be wise to get insurance, which he did. And this insurance not only covered his cargo, but also his ship on any given sea voyage. How it would work is lenders would lend money to these seafarers using the ship and its loot as collateral. The lender would say, hey, your boat is worth 2 gold ingots and everything in it is worth 5 gold ingots. Great, I'll give you 7 gold ingots. If you come back from your journey of trade with 10 ingots worth of stuff, that's great. Give me 9 ingots. That means I make a 2 ingot profit and you make a 1 ingot profit. But if your ship sinks while you're on this voyage, you don't have to give me anything. That's essentially how the insurance existed, and this helped mitigate the risk for the seafarer and also gave these lenders the opportunity to make money with some risk, but obviously nobody was going to be incentivized to sink their own ship or not come back with loot. The whole point of the voyage was to make money, right? That's where Hegestratos comes in. Hegestratos realized that he didn't actually need to go on any adventures at all, and he didn't even need to fill up his boat with loot. What Hegestratos ended up deciding to do was he would fill his ship with things that looked valuable, and what he would typically do was fill crates with sand, cheap ornaments, with sometimes boxes of valuables on top to make it appear that the whole ship was full of valuables, when in reality there was a layer of valuables on top of a lot of boxes of basically garbage. This would make the ship appear heavy and full and also give creditors a good reason to give him a good insurance policy. Already, Hegestratos was scamming because creditors would give Hegestratos an inflated value, essentially. If Hegestratos was able to convince creditors that his boat was worth at least 2 gold ingots and the contents of his boat were extremely expensive dyes and spices and metals, maybe they would say that the contents of his boat were worth 10 gold ingots, when in reality it was only worth 2 gold ingots when the rest was dirt and sand. That is obviously a scam. But now, sure, Hegestratos has a bunch of gold ingots, but he also has debt, and he's not going to go sail away and make money off of dirt. So what does he do instead? Well, he would go take this boat and deliberately sink it. Now, all of the money that the creditor had given him was his money, fair and straight, and he really was out nothing, and he could continue this plan over and over. And it wasn't long before Hegestratos' scam was exposed. And this kind of shocked the ancient Greek world, because during this time, there was integrity and respect for the law and understanding when it came to commerce. And such a fraud was not even necessarily thought of. But when this scam was exposed, it kind of exposed the vulnerability in these early financial contracts and how people could manipulate things in a way that may seem counterintuitive, but would ultimately be beneficial for the scammer. The case of Hegestratos is considered to be one of the biggest scams of the Classical Era. Not only because it was just so ballsy, but also because it was the first instance of insurance scam and kind of gave the entire insurance industry a huge shakeup and a wake-up call for how they had to protect themselves moving forward when they were crediting people who could potentially screw them over. So yeah, the Classical Era, I'm sure, had more scams than you could count, but I definitely think the case of Hegestratos is one of the most interesting and definitely one of the most defining of this time period. The Medieval Era. I don't know about you, but I feel like the medieval era is definitely one of the most interesting parts of history. You have castles, knights, kingdoms, wealth inequality, and a plethora of scams. What is there not to enjoy? It was honestly a bit tough to pick just one scam for the medieval era, but I'm happy with the one I chose, so let's get right into it. There's no doubt that in medieval times, the Christian religion was everything. And this is kind of proven by all of the art, architecture, writings, everything was the Christian religion. And with every fan base comes collectors. And while the Christian religion didn't necessarily have marketable plushies at the time, they definitely had a huge underground market for relics. And these relics were definitely odd, to to say the least. Potentially the most famous Christian relic would be the Holy Grail, but it's definitely not the only relic that people were interested in getting their hands on, with some of the most popular and sought after ancient relics being the literal bones of saints. Like, let's say there was a famous saint who was very prolific and known in the church. Well, once they die, if you could get one of their bones, you could possess their magical powers. Like, literally, that was the mindset. Merchants and other saints and even individuals wanted these bones for a plethora of different reasons. Wealthy individuals would typically want to collect these relics to help make their own desires and dreams come true, as these Christian relics were believed to essentially cause miracles. And in that instance, if there was an object that could bless you, that could make all of your dreams come true, that could protect your family and defeat your enemies, is there really a price you wouldn't pay for them? But here's the thing. Not many people had this money at all. And what people resorted to was visiting churches that had these relics so that they could gain the power and benefit of them from a fraction of the price. And that's exactly why bishops and priests would collect these relics. Obviously, they would see the value of these blessed items that could provide miracles as something that they would want to have in their life and in their church, but they also noticed that any church with a relic was gaining more foot traffic, more donations, and became more or less of a landmark and a hotspot for pilgrimages. And this is where the business opportunity arose. Merchants, whether they believed in the power of these relics or not, if a merchant was able to get their hands on a relic at a decent price, they could sell it to almost anybody with money for an astonishing profit. Here's the issue. As the popularity and demand grew for relics, the supply didn't really. Which was great for investors because, supply and demand, but that also gave incentive for others. The only way that a relic could really even be brought into this underground market was by a crusader who would go and reclaim the relic from the Holy Land, or a merchant who would do business in the Holy Land, hopefully trying to get a relic or something close to a relic that they could buy cheap and sell for a massive profit back in Europe. But these two methods were slow and could not keep up with demand whatsoever, which is why some interesting individuals decided to help contribute to that supply chain issue. Here's the deal. Obviously, these relics have absolutely no certificate of authenticity or receipt or any sort of tracking on where they came from. It's essentially just word of mouth. So if you were a respected or authoritative or even just a charismatic figure, you could kind of pass off anything as a relic with enough convincing. And that's exactly the scam that we are going to discuss. Fake black market Christian relics. Some famous examples of this would be fake bones. For example, St. John the Baptist was a famous saint that people claimed to have relics of, and these relics were his bones. But once all of the bones that were claimed to be his were accounted for and organized, it was concluded that either St. John had 3 heads and 5 arms, or some people had some fake relics. 2 other famous and common fake relics were pieces of the Holy Shroud and splinters from the cross that Jesus was crucified on. Obviously, any part of either of these items would have extreme significance to history, and even the tiniest morsel of either of these items would be massively valuable. And for that reason, people decided to make their own. At the time, the only way that these relics could be verified is if they actually had provable miracle abilities. So if a church had a relic in it and somebody with a disability was healed, or a sick person was made healthy again, or a dying person was living longer, or a poor man came into money, if any of these happened after somebody encountered the relic would have been proved real. And the people who had experienced miracles from these relics would go and tell their friends and their family, essentially marketing the church that had this relic in-house. But even with that being said, who's to say if these people had experienced miracles from genuine or non-genuine items? It really kind of gets messy from there. Once the industry of fake relics began to become exposed, it was almost a running joke at the time that if they bought all of the splinters being sold from the cross, they would actually be able to build a warship out of all of the wood. If anybody tries to sell you a piece of wood telling you that it came from the cross that Jesus was crucified on, I would probably pass, or at least confirm it can do miracles before you buy it. The Renaissance era. If you've watched any of my time period videos, you would know that I've actually never covered the Renaissance era by itself, mostly because the time period itself is short and kind of similar to the era that took place before it. One of the most famous figures to come out of the Renaissance era was Michelangelo, likely most famous for his statue of David. But did you know that he got his start by scamming? Circa 1496, Michelangelo sculpted a marble sleeping Cupid. It was an extremely lifelike and beautiful sculpture that highlighted exactly how talented Michelangelo was even at an early age. But during the Renaissance era, art collectors weren't necessarily looking for modern art. They were looking for historic pieces, which typically meant ancient Roman or Greek statues, rather than new ones. So what Michelangelo did with this statue of the Cupid was he decided, instead of selling it for a cheaper price compared to the antiques, he decided to make his new statue an antique by intentionally wearing it down. It's not quite confirmed how he did it, but he made sure to make this sculpture look worn. And it obviously worked because he was actually able to sell it as a lost Roman antiquity. And not only was he able to sell it, but he sold it for a much higher price than he was initially looking for. This sculpture was actually sold to a cardinal, Raphael Riario, who initially was fooled, but eventually discovered the truth. When Cardinal Raphael discovered the truth and confronted Michelangelo, he wasn't upset with him, he was actually impressed, and he invited Michelangelo to Rome. And when Michelangelo came to Rome, he was given his first major opportunity in his career, and this was the actual opportunity that launched Michelangelo's career and made him the icon that he is today. This cardinal was able to understand the genius of the young Michelangelo, and was likely thinking that if he could point him in the right direction, he could create one of the best artists of all time. So yeah, as far as Renaissance scams are concerned, I think Michelangelo selling one of his original artworks as an antiquity summarizes this era perfectly. And it's kind of ironic to think that Michelangelo literally had to make his art something else to try and sell it. Regardless, Michelangelo was dope. But when he was starting out, he was definitely clever when it came to selling his art. The early modern era. We've covered a lot of scams in this video so far, but one scam we haven't covered is the fake king scam. Obviously, because you can't fake being a king, right? There's no way you can just tell people that, hey, actually, I'm the king. Not only are people not going to believe you, but you're likely going to be killed. And that's the truth unless your name was Perkin Warbeck, who in the 1490s not only claimed to be a king, but also became a serious threat for the reigning king at the time. And he gained significant backing and support. But before we get to how this entire scam ends, let me tell you how it starts. Perkin Warbeck claimed to be the younger of the two princes in the tower, which, if you're unfamiliar, the princes in the tower refers to a mysterious disappearance of two young royals. King Edward V of England and his younger brother, Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. They were both heirs to the throne of King Edward IV of England, but at the ages of 12 and 9, they were locked away in the Tower of London by their uncle, and they were never seen again. This obviously caused a lot of issues within the kingdom, but for Perkin Warbeck, this created an opportunity. Before pretending to be a king, Warbeck was born into a rich merchant class family and traveled around and spent time in Ireland selling silks before him and his friend came up with the plan to impersonate the younger of the two brothers who disappeared. As this missing person was not only not found, but was an heir to a throne, meaning that if this person was found, they had legitimate claim to the kingdom, which is definitely a title worth fighting for. Warbeck didn't just necessarily hit the streets telling everybody, hey, by the way, I'm the prince and I'm back and I'm totally good. He was very strategic in who he decided to lay his claim to, which was high-ranking government officials. He gained his first piece of notable support from King Charles VIII of France. And this is a major piece of backing to have behind you, because if the king of another country recognizes and supports you as the lost heir to a throne, you have some serious credibility to your claim. But this didn't last long. As King Henry VII, the current king, had formed an alliance with the King of France, there was no longer support from the King of France to be helping Perkin Warbeck. So we kind of had to start from scratch once again. So the next place that Perkin Warbeck went for support is actually insane, because he went to the actual sister of the lost princes in the tower, and not only did he go there to claim that he was her long-lost brother, but she bought it up. She was like, oh yeah, you are totally my long-lost brother. And now this support was likely even more valuable than the initial support, because no sibling is going to accept a faker as their long-lost sibling, right? Regardless of their beliefs or intentions, this duchess appeared to believe Perkin Warbeck, and with this support, Perkin continued his conquest to claim that he was the long-lost king. The following year, in 1493, he attended the funeral of Maximilian's father, Frederick III, where he was actually recognized as King Richard IV of England at the funeral. And it only took 2 more years in 1495 for support for Warbeck to have the throne bubbling within England. Warbeck was actually able to gather an army of 150 people and attempted a landing in Kent, where Warbeck and his small army were met with locals who were loyal to their actual king, Henry VII, and the Battle of Deal ensued. Most of this army died, and Warbeck retreated back to Ireland. But even in Ireland, he was facing issues and once again fled to Scotland. While in Scotland, Perkin was actually able to set up an arranged marriage with one of the relatives of the king, known as Lady Catherine Gordon. And now, after officially becoming royalty in some regard, the Scottish palace was open to Warbeck to gather his army and begin to plan another attack on England. The attack that Perkin Warbeck and the Scottish king had planned ended up failing before it even started. And what I mean by that is, before the battle even started, they essentially retreated. But the following year, the Scottish king and Warbeck tried again, but this time their landing was different. In 1497, support for the current king of England was low, primarily to new taxes and rising legislation. And for this reason, and because more time had passed for people to sympathize with Perkin, who was pretending to be the lost king, there was slightly more popularity for him on English soil. So this landing was met with some support. He actually was able to raise a rebellion and was declared King Richard IV, the person he was claiming to be this entire time. And at this point, it may have seemed that his plan was successful, and his next plan of attack was to siege the city, where King Henry VII was currently residing. And this siege failed, and once again, his men died, and Perkin Warbeck had to go into hiding once again. And he was able to flee successfully. Well, at least successfully because he escaped the battle alive, but not fully successfully, because the place that he ended up residing applied a lot of pressure to Perkin. So much pressure so that he actually ended up surrendering himself to the English government, because he was promised a pardon if he surrendered instead of causing any more battles. In 1497, while being tried in front of the real king himself, Perkin Warbeck finally came clean about his elaborate scam and fake life. He told the king that he was not the prince in the tower and he was not royalty whatsoever. He straight up admitted to being a pretender because he was promised immunity for telling the truth. But obviously that wasn't the case. After this admission, he was kept close to the king and essentially imprisoned. And a year later, he actually tried to escape England, where he was caught and brought back, and at that point he was put ironically in the Tower of London, where the initial two lost princes were lost from. And it was in here where Perkin Warbeck tried to plan another escape and another overthrowing of the government essentially. That plan was uncovered and Perkin Warbeck was executed in 1499. This was a bit of a longer segment, but I wanted to go into detail because this story is literally insane. In a 9-year span, Perkin Warbeck is going from a rich kid who's just living in Ireland selling silk to, from the suggestion of a friend, dedicating the next 9 years of his life essentially on a conquest to claim that he is the long lost heir to the throne and trying to overthrow the English king, in which he almost does successfully and ends up admitting everything and then dying because of it. If that's not a scam, I don't know what is.